Hello, everyone. Welcome. People can take their seats. Really great to have everyone. I sort of feel like I'm welcoming you back to school today because everyone's going back to school. So thanks everyone for coming. We have a great turnout. I know that we filled up the seats here, so a lot of people looking on and watching online as well. So thanks to you, those people that waited a little bit online while we're gathering together as well. So I'm Ari Schwartz. I am the coordinator of I guess director of the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law, and I am managing director for cybersecurity services here at Venable. Really exciting topic on talking about offensive cyber today. Something that usually we haven't had a session, full day session on. It's usually like just one panel, right? And but we felt like now is really a good time because one of the things we like to do at the center is really focus on what's the conventional wisdom in this space. And there's so many different areas right now that are being talked about here that we felt like it was really worth a day to kind of go over where we stand right now as we see a lot more discussion about what the policy should be in the future. So I expect a lot of discussion about things we've seen in the past, where things stand right now, and then questions for the future, really, for this from this that can actually help to form some good discussion for policymakers going forward. Beautiful day. We have this like little balcony out here, and people should feel free during the breaks to go out there. I'm certainly going to be out there. So I also want to thank Google for helping to sponsor, as well as Venable with the center sponsoring the food and the drinks that we have today. So I'm going to hand things over to the person who's done all the work on this, which is Stacey O'Mara, and really my pleasure to do that. She's done such a great job putting this thing together. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ari. Am I still live here? Okay. Good morning, everybody in the room, and those of you joining virtually. Thanks so much, and welcome to the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law here at Venable. It's really wonderful and encouraging to see such a strong showing for today's conversation. And again, special thank you to Google as well for sponsoring a portion of today's activities. We're glad to have you here with us. The cybersecurity landscape has grown increasingly complex. For many years, the emphasis was almost entirely on defense, patching vulnerabilities, sharing threat intelligence, and building resilience against attacks. But as we all know, the challenges of today extend far beyond defense alone. Adversaries are more aggressive and more sophisticated, using cyber operations to achieve both geopolitical and economic objectives. That reality forces us to grapple with some difficult questions. Should private industry be permitted to take direct action against attackers? What tools and authorities solely belong to governments? And how do we prevent well-intentioned actions from escalating into broader conflict? The center has been focused on these questions and more for the past several months. We've convened listening sessions to talk through this topic and produced a paper this spring, which we laid out some of what we've observed from subject matter experts, a lot of you here in the room, and including some of the potential risks associated with those actions. For example, we observed from our SMEs that offensive activity by the private sector could create legal exposure, where actions cross domestic or international boundaries and trigger costly litigation or diplomatic fallout. It could cause collateral damage, since malicious infrastructure often runs through compromised systems owned by innocent third parties. It risks reputational and diplomatic consequences if actions are perceived as aggressive or unprovoked. And it could contribute to the normalization of offensive tactics, thereby lowering the bar for less responsible actors worldwide. And of course, there's the risk of retaliation, that one action invites another, escalating threats rather than reducing them. Given these risks, we determined the need to think carefully about potential models for how the private sector might work with government, and to also consider other potential strategies for deterrence in general. One model might be a dedicated cyber force, a government-led unit staffed by experts and operating under clear legal authorities. Another approach could involve pre-certified private entities, vetted and authorized to carry out narrowly defined operations under strict oversight. We could also envision a regulated cyber market with licensing and accountability mechanisms. Or we could expand existing public-private sector partnerships, enabling companies to engage in active defense with legal protections and federal support. Each of these models obviously have trade-offs. Coordination, oversight, and accountability are essential if we want to reduce risk while improving resilience. And that's really the primary objective for today, to explore offensive cyber operations, or quote unquote active cyber defense measures, as a tool amongst many in our toolbox. Offensive cyber operations exist on a spectrum. At one end are active defense measures designed to disrupt malicious infrastructure before it causes harms. At the other are operations with strategic or geopolitical consequences. Navigating this spectrum likely requires clear legal frameworks, disciplined decision-making, and trust among partners, all of us here in this room and online. That includes government, industry, and the international community. That balance between offense and defense, between action and restraint, is at the heart of today's conversations. We'll hear perspectives on whether, quote unquote, hacking back is appropriate, how offensive tools can be applied responsibly, how industry can act under real-time pressure, and how we should think about red lines and rules of the road in a global context. Today's speakers bring deep experience from government, industry, law, and academia. Their insights will help us think through not only what's possible, but what's wise, what's lawful, and what's strategically sound. Our goal is not to settle every debate today, but to move the conversation forward in a way that strengthens both our security and our collective trust. With that framing in mind, let's begin. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dmitry Alpovich, the chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, who is internationally recognized for his expertise on nation-state cyber threats and has been at the forefront of advancing both strategy and policy in this field. He's been a leading voice at the crossroads of cybersecurity, geopolitics, and strategy. As co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike, he helped build one of the world's most influential cybersecurity firms and played a pivotal role in exposing state-sponsored cyber operations such as Operation Aurora. Today, he leads the Silverado Policy Accelerator, a forward-looking think tank addressing policy challenges ranging from cyber and international trade to industrial security. Thank you for joining us today, Dmitry, and thank you all again for being here.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Thanks for having me. Thank you for organizing this event. You know, in DC, I think every policy idea dies and then gets resurrected every 10 or 15 years. And I was certainly, as many of you know, on the front line of the original fight on this issue and have the scars to show for it. But nevertheless, as I was thinking last night about giving this talk, I prepared some remarks that hopefully will set the context for the discussion of the day. So, there are many in the industry that have said for many, many years now that it is dangerous to engage in cyber offense because it is inherently escalatory. It would encourage, their argument goes, a tit-for-tat response from our adversaries, one which we can't possibly win since we, in this country and in the broader West, live in a glass house, given our overall reliance in our society on networks and computer systems. They say we're more vulnerable than our enemies and thus cannot achieve escalation dominance. Let me offer you a proposition that this argument is utter nonsense. In fact, the complete opposite is true. It is passive defense that encourages escalation on the part of our adversaries. Imagine living in a physical world without consequences, where there's no investigation of crimes, no punishments are being feted out. In fact, we don't have to imagine it. There are plenty of places like that around the world, many in failed states, where criminal and terrorist networks run amok, and innocent civilians live in perpetual fear of having their life or property seized from them at any moment. Those places tend to be true hellholes, where life only gets more lawless and dangerous by the day, where there's no accountability, there's no peace and stability. The same has been true in cyber. For decades now, we have had very limited accountability for malicious acts online due to the challenges of prosecuting offenders, be they criminals, hacktivists, or nation-state actors acting on their country's orders, and operating out of hostile legal jurisdictions. As a result of this effective impunity that has been created, it is indisputable that attacks have only gotten worse. Whereas in the early era of the internet, the 90s and early 2000s, we had to mostly worry about various online scams, trying to steal your bank accounts, your credit card numbers, or peddle you Viagra pills. Today, we're dealing with much more dangerous actors that target our hospitals and school districts with ransomware, publish stolen psychiatric diagnoses, attempt to manipulate the human-machine interface of our water systems, and even collaborate with vicious gangs like MS-13 and use threats and actions of physical violence against employees working in telecommunications to clone SIM cards to bypass two-factor authentication. On virtually every metric of severity, damage to our society, and impact to our livelihoods, and even indeed human life itself, things are much worse today than they were 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And at the same time, our adversaries have only gotten stronger and more capable. In the late 1800s in Sicily, rich landowners would hire local small-time thugs, mafiosi as they were called, to protect their orchards from theft and sabotage in the lawlessness of weak post-unification Italy. Thugs that, in the absence of any consequence and any counterforce, would later emerge into a parallel system of power that a century later would rise to challenge the Italian state itself, a top 5 global economy and a NATO member. Similarly, over the last 30 years, small-time cybercriminals operating with near total legal impunity out of Russia would build sophisticated criminal syndicates enabled by global reach of innovative affiliate network business model that would keep evolving and design more and more complex illicit schemes that would bring enormous financial benefits to them and their associates. Even when their operations haven't been successful due to good defenses, or due to them being disrupted by law enforcement or private sector action, as opposed to being deterred from further criminal activity, they would almost always double down their efforts and pursue their innocent prey with even more innovation and persistence. Similarly, in the nation-state realm, absolutely nothing that we have done to name and shame, indict, or on very rare occasions, even prosecute foreign intelligence operatives for perpetrating economic espionage, theft of national secrets, targeting of critical infrastructure for the purposes of preparing the military battlefield for future conflict, political system interference, crypto and other financial asset theft, as well as intimidation and blackmail. Nothing has made a dent in reducing any of these activities against us. To the contrary, the attacks are becoming more brazen, more careless and dangerous, and more of our unannounced red lines keep falling by the wayside. So the very idea that in this current bleak state of affairs, engaging in cyber offense is escalatory, I would propose to you, is laughable. After all, what are our adversaries going to escalate to in response? Ransom more of our hospitals? Penetrate more of our water and electric utilities? Steal even more of our IP and financial assets? It's hard to believe that is even possible, and if it is, trust me, it's not for lack of effort on their part. One could argue, of course, that they could resort to more intentionally vindictive and disruptive action beyond just ransomware. For example, they could do immediate damage to our cyber physical systems, not just infiltrate them for the purposes of espionage or prepositions for attacks to be conducted later at a more opportune time, as they do today. Sure, I can see that is possible. But here's what's interesting. It is actually remarkable how very few truly destructive cyber physical attacks we have seen in the entire history of this domain. Stuxnet, attacks on power grid in Ukraine, attempted Trident attack on Saudi refinery, attacks on industrial control systems at Iranian steel companies. These are perhaps the most prominent examples of cyber physical attacks, and it is striking how small this list is. I would propose to you that that is not an accident. And it is not due to the lack of capability on the part of our adversaries to execute such attacks on a wider scale and with much greater frequency. The reason for their scarcity leads me to the debunking of the other myth often perpetrated by what we might call the cyber peaceniks crowd. The idea that we here in the United States live in a uniquely vulnerable glass house and thus are much more exposed than our adversaries to cyber disruption. This was certainly true 20, 30 years ago. It was even partially true a decade ago. It is absolutely not the case today. Today, with the possible and partial at best exception of North Korea, all of our nation-state adversaries are just as reliant on modern IT systems and communications. Their banks, factories, critical infrastructure, and even militaries are all being run on Western software and hardware that is often extensively connected to the internet. And compared to our networks, whose security certainly more often than not does need to be considerably better, cyber defense posture of many of our adversaries' networks is virtually universally atrocious or even non-existent. So the most likely reason why we don't see more overtly destructive attacks being conducted against us today in our own OT systems is due to deterrence. The fear that we might retaliate in cyber or other ways, in ways so devastating that our adversaries don't attempt to try. Thus, I would pose to you, ladies and gentlemen, that not only is engaging in thoughtful and careful cyber offenses not escalatory, but not doing so is. Now, not all cyber offense ideas are smart and effective. Indeed, most probably aren't. And who, government or private sector, under what authorities, and how should practice it is a topic that deserves much careful consideration. Most cyber offensive ideas I've seen floated in public and even private conversations are likely not going to create deterrent effects for our adversaries who are driven by greed or strategic national priorities. To change this dynamic of the ever-worsening landscape that we currently face in the digital domain, we have to think of smart ways to combine all of the toolkits of our power, including but not limited to cyber, for coordinated combined arms effect. In warfare, every unit and weapon system, infantry, minefields, artillery, EW, long-range strikes, air support, drones, they all have to be synchronized as a perfect orchestra to achieve effects. There is no single Wunderwaffe or tactic that can achieve victory. It is the smart use of these combined capabilities that brings about success. The same is true in the digital domain. We can't succeed in stabilizing this virtual battlefield with reliance only on singular capabilities like cyber offense or indictments. We need to be thinking about ways to achieve the effects that we want with the right strategies and balance of offense, economic pressures, diplomacy, law enforcement action, covert action, and threat of military retaliation if appropriate. I hope that over the course of the day here at these beautiful offices at Venable, you will explore some of them. I want to leave you with one last thought, and I'll perhaps uncharacteristically now offer a word of caution. Too often, especially in this town, decision makers look at an issue that they need to address and ask the wrong question. They don't ask, how should we respond to this problem? Instead, they ask, how can we respond to it? As the saying goes, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We should not jump at the chance to pull out our latest nifty cyber weapon out of our toolbox and drop it on our adversaries with great excitement for having done something that makes us feel good. That's not how you fight winning battles and wars in the physical world or in cyberspace. Instead, we should think about the effects we want to achieve against criminal actors or even nation states that might alter their decision calculus and behavior, and then ask what tools we might have to bring about the outcome and in what targeting sequence and strike packages they should be employed. Some of them might be cyber, most likely will not, but starting with an objective and a goal versus jumping to the means and capabilities is always going to lead you to a more fruitful outcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for that. And hitting that point that I think you're going to start to hear today as well, that perhaps cyber doesn't have to be the only means for pushing back at our adversaries around the world. So I appreciate that, that comment. If I could start welcoming our panelists for panel number one, I'll start to a brief introduction of our moderator. There we go. Okay, so our first panel is going to explore some of the challenges, risks, pros, and cons to the private sector participating in offensive cyber operations. Moderating this, come on up, guys. Moderating this discussion is Jen Daskal, my colleague here. She's a partner in cybersecurity services at Venable, a highly respected authority on cyber law with experience at the U.S. Department of Justice and in academia. With over 2 decades of experience in law, policy, and public service, Jen is a trusted authority at the nexus of technology, national security, and privacy. As a former Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to the President and Acting General Counsel at DHS, she led legal and policy teams during complex cyber and public safety incidents. At Venable, she continues to guide clients through crisis response, data governance challenges, cross-border frameworks, and emerging tech risks, drawing on her deep background in government and litigation strategy. So thank you so much to this first panel. We'll have 30 minutes of discussion between the group, and then we will open it up to Q&A, and there are mics on the side of the room. Over to you, Jen. Thank you.
Great. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am delighted to be part of this very important conversation, and I want to thank Stacy in particular for her expertise and unfailing energy in pulling all of this together. So thank you. We have a lot to cover and not a lot of time. So I'm going to do brief intros to our panelists, and then we are going to delve right in. We will make sure that there is time for audience questions at the end. I emphasize the word questions. I'm going to start, I'll go my left to I'll start at the end. We'll start with Kristen Flynn Goodwin. She is the managing partner of Advanced Cyber Law. This is a boutique firm that is based in Redmond, Washington. Before starting up the firm in 2023, Kristen spent almost 20 years as the head cybersecurity lawyer for Microsoft, where she was responsible for supporting the Microsoft Security Response Center and the founding and supporting of the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. She also hosts the Advancing Cyber podcast. Next is Rob Sheldon. He is the Senior Director of Public Policy and Strategy at CrowdStrike, where he leads corporate engagement on multiple international and U.S. governmental policies, programs, and initiatives. He is also an adjunct professor teaching cybersecurity policy at American University and a board member of the Partnership for Secure America. Next, we have Megan Stifel, the Chief Strategy Officer at the Nonprofit Institute for Security and Technology, where she also serves as the Executive Director of the Ransomware Task Force. Megan previously held multiple positions at the Department of Justice, where she was my colleague, including as a FISA attorney, a computer crime prosecutor, and as the National Security Division's Director for Cyber Policy. In addition, she served as the Director for International Cyber Policy at the National Security Council. And last, but certainly not least, we have Frank Filifo, who is the Director of the McCrary Institute for Cyber and Critical Infrastructure Security at Auburn University. He was a member of the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. He served on the Department of Homeland Security's Advisory Council, and he also previously served as a special assistant to President George Bush in the then newly created White House Office of Homeland Security. So as you see, we have no shortage of incredible expertise on this panel, and I'm really excited to delve in. I want to start by just laying the groundwork. Just, we heard a lot about the threat, but I just want to take a step back and make sure we have a baseline understanding of what is the threat that we're dealing with, particularly what have we learned in the wake of Salt and Bolt Typhoon. And I'm going to start with Rob to just kind of lay out some of the threat background for us.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm not going to spend too much time on what the threat looks like, because I think most folks in this room have a pretty good sense of it, but I'm going to spend some time talking about how the threat has evolved a little bit over time, because I think that that's important. In general, at CrowdStrike, we think about threat actors in terms of three buckets: nation state threat actors, criminal groups or e-crime groups, and then hacktivists, people that are sort of motivated by social or political ends. And really, if you look at any threat activity that gets reported in the newspaper every day, it's something that can be grouped into one-ish of those buckets. And Dimitri mentioned a bunch of the different types of threats earlier, so again, not going to spend too much time on that, but you could think about people who are, essentially trying to pursue geopolitical aims. That could be through attacking critical infrastructure or through stealing intellectual property. And then people who are monetizing hacking. And then again, like I said previously, people that have a political or social objective and they're pursuing that in some way or another through cyber. So anyways, that's your 30 seconds on, on the what. But the how, I think, for the purpose of this conversation is a little bit more interesting. And what we've seen recently that's changed there is attacks that are more creative and indeed quicker than we've seen in previous years. So the part that's creative is that it's no longer all that straightforward for people who are taking some control of their own defenses to breach normal enterprises, in part because some of the tooling and defensive systems that organizations have in place these days are better than they were, 5 years ago and even 2 years ago. So from the perspective of the threat actor, it's more straightforward to attack unmanaged devices, things that are like routers, VPN concentrators, things that sit on the edge of the network but are not so easily defended by your core enterprise defense technology, things like endpoint detection and response. So that's one thing that we need to look out for. And that, when you've seen most of some of the critical infrastructure attacks we've seen, that has been the sort of pathway the threat actors have used to breach a lot of these enterprises, going through one of those sort of edge devices and being able to move laterally into a network and then be able to do their work from that point. Often because these things are legacy devices, it's less straightforward to understand how the adversary got in there, or indeed if they are in there in the first place. Even when you have a sense of that, it can be difficult to verify that you've done a remediation that actually ejects them from the network. The other thing that's, I think, relevant, and again, is a sort of a response to having better defensive capabilities on the enterprise generally, is attacks that leverage essentially social engineering and people calling into help desks, impersonating employees that are in the enterprise, or the inverse, calling employees impersonating the help desk. Things that have happened at a high level for really decades in the space, but is being done in a much more persistent and effective way at this point, given the propensity or given the sort of density, I should say, of SaaS apps in the enterprise now, and just the frequency with which you do have help desk functions that need to give people access to these things, need to reset passwords, need to essentially give people access to their accounts on new devices. People have their own smartphones, they get new computers all the time. So calling up to help desk to get this sort of thing set up is not uncommon. And it really is difficult to establish identity with someone who's going to persistently try and target an enterprise. So many of the attacks that we see at this point do leverage these sort of compromised identities, and those are being very effective. The final point to mention just briefly here is the increase in essentially remote IT worker scams and things like that. This is an interesting development because it's kind of exists off of a e-crime template, but it's being done in particular by North Koreans, and is effectively for revenue generation. So that is getting resources to fund illicit activities from the North Korean regime. But there's also instances where we've seen them target intellectual property and that sort of thing. And this is a very difficult problem because it's not a cyber problem per se. It's like a recruitment problem, an HR problem, a internal security problem. And anytime you talk about those problems, it's getting buy-in from more people in the enterprise than just your security team, who, like all of us, is somewhat, we're somewhat skittish. We have a high degree of threat salience and things like that. But talking to the recruiting team and sometimes the HR team, in addition to having some additional privacy issues to navigate and that sort of thing, it's also just making sure that they feel the sort of importance of the threat and the need to sort of, as an enterprise or organization, wrap one's arms around it. So I'll stop there for now.
Great, thank you. Frank, turn to you to anything to add to that, and also just to talk a little bit about your perspective as to how the U.S. government is or is not responding at the moment.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. And thank you for the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you. I'll try to be provocative, but Dimitri was very provocative. And dare I say, I agree with almost everything he laid out. And in part, it's because we have been playing the victim in the cyber domain for far too long. Our adversaries face few to no consequences for bad behavior. If we start looking at just the typhoons, which are top of mind of everyone, whether Vault, whether Salt, whether Flax, whether you name the typhoon, to expect a different outcome if we respond the same way every time is pretty foolish. And that's precisely where we are. We're reactive. And I'm going to say, where I am provocative, I almost don't care if we win the cyber war. I care if we win the war and how cyber plays into national strategy and our broader national security instruments. So all things said and done, I do think we need to get to the point where we can be a little more proactive. That doesn't mean wild, wild west cowboys shooting wildly. In fact, quite the opposite, because the potential for escalation is real here. But the flip side is to expect that our adversaries have changed their behavior when we haven't gone in that direction is, again, a little foolish. So I think we need to get to the point where we can recalibrate some of our activities. I am a big proponent of going beyond the public-private partnership discussion and information sharing and toward a more operational collaboration environment. But again, I think it's in support of government, not the other way around. And I do think there is some momentum around all of this, and I'm not sure we're going to get it right. But the reality is if we don't attempt, we're going to continue to be in the same situation we've been in for a very, very, very long time. So I do think the active cyber defense questions, which is not hackback, it's not as simple as that, but it's proactive steps industry can take in support of and in partnership with government can go a long way. Think of, in a football analogy, it's not you're a linebacker. You're blitzing the other team's quarterback because they're continually trying to score on us. So that doesn't necessarily mean sometimes you're going to get a pick six and you'll get an interception and score. But at the end of the day, we've got to get to the point where there is some cost imposition. And right now, I think that that's limited at best. And we ultimately need to induce changes in behavior. So I'm having a hard time delineating between proxies and nation states these days. It's getting very difficult to know who's the puppet, who's the master. What we do know, though, is they're all provided safe haven, unfettered access, and we've got to be able to figure out how we can drain some of that swamp, whether it's in Russia, whether it's in parts of Asia. North Korea is not operating out of Pyongyang alone. They're operating out of other regions in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. And that's where I think we can start having some impact and consequence. All that said and done, I do think offense is a part of the equation, but it's not the end all be all. Because when you look at cyber, it is its own domain, but it transcends everything we do as societies, everything we do as government, everything we do as industry. So ultimately, I think it's figuring out where you can have greatest impact, where you can impose significant cost, and actually having the political will to do that. We've talked about this for a long time, but I feel like I've seen this movie many, 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 many times. So the question is, how do we get all our efforts focused in a strategic approach that I think Dimitri laid out pretty well.
Thanks. Kristen, you just heard Frank talk about a potentially evolving relationship between the public and private sectors. I wonder if you could take a step back and just talk a little bit about what the relationship has been historically, and then your reaction to Frank's call for a shift in that relationship.
Sure. I struggle with the term offensive cyber. I just don't think it's the right one for the situation. As we think about what does it mean, offensive cyber, right? Offense wins games, defense wins championships, There's so many different types of taglines we could look for and bumper stickers. But, at its core, what we would think about when we were debating these issues, back in 2015, when this issue first arose and over the years was, if data is stolen, are you talking about encrypting it in place? Are you talking about trying to re-exfiltrate it, reacquire the data? Are you trying to disable the machine that it's on? Are you trying to disable the infrastructure of the actor? Are you trying to look at enumerate the accounts that the actor has or the servers the actor has? What exactly are you trying to talk about? Where is the infrastructure? On whose systems is that infrastructure? Do you control it? What third parties control that? What jurisdictions do those pieces of infrastructure sit in? The complexity starts to grow exponentially. So when you think about hacking back, that frontier justice feeling of they stole something from me, I want it back. Remember back in 2015, we were dealing with a lot of nation state thefts of data. That was the time of the Obama-Xi negotiation of stopping all of the Chinese data thefts, right? It was very front of mind for a lot of American companies. We're seeing this emerge now in the era of the ransomware attacks, and how do we stop these criminal gangs from going after us? But as somebody who has actively done what are not hackbacks against particular organizations, but offensive cyber operations. Microsoft did the first offensive cyber operation against a nation state group called Zinc back in 2017. And we disrupted the nation state group. I'll tell you what, it has an amazing emotional effect, right? It feels fantastic to disrupt a nation state actor, and then it knocks them offline for a few months. And then they're back online doing what they do because, as others have said, they have an objective. They've been tasked. They're going to pursue that objective as zealously as possible. Then, we did a disruption against a private sector offensive actor, cyber mercenary. Feels great, but those companies are funded. They have customers. They will pursue that objective again. And so we keep looking for ways to disrupt asynchronously this problem instead of stepping back and looking at different ways to solve it. There have been lots of cases brought in the civil courts to seize infrastructure and try to bring that down. That's almost been a uniquely Microsoft endeavor because of the cost and the effort involved in that. So again, hacking back or disrupting these actors is not working in the broadest possible sense in the civil system. So when you think about what do private sector companies need to do or what can we do, we have a lot of tools, we have a lot of visibility, we have a lot of capability. What we don't have is the ability to come up with a broader societal understanding of what objectives and outcomes are there and the consequence management writ large at a societal level. That's the job of government. And I think that's the harder part of this equation. Hacking back feels good, that take back what was stolen, but it doesn't really work. You can see today with the technology we all have in our pockets, if you lose your phone or somebody steals it, you can literally see what apartment it's in. And it's really frustrating when you can't get that back. That's what we're talking about writ large. My data has been stolen, and it's so maddening when you can't do anything about it. But solving the problem at scale, solving the ransomware attacks at scale, the nation state attacks at scale, that's not a single company, and it's certainly not a single victim's problem to solve. That's the bigger problem that hacking back will never get to. And so I turn it back to Jennifer to up-level us and push us a bit more.
Thanks. So I'm going to turn it to Megan to just pick up from there and talk a little bit about your perspective about the relationship between the public and the private sector, particularly given Kristen and Frank's comments a moment ago.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Stacey, for organizing this. It's great to be here. And I just want to caveat that while I one time practiced law in this area, I do not. So the following are just many of my opinions on the topic, much of which I still can't say much about. But I do want to just comment about one thing. I think where we begin this conversation does matter to a certain extent about how we shape the conversation. So I came into this conversation further back when we were initially concerned about the use of US providers' infrastructure, and in that case, telephony and email systems, to perpetrate, recruit, and plan terrorist attacks. And this was the pre-cloud era. So the idea of hacking back or conducting computer network attack or offensive cyber operations, initially when I started talking about this, we couldn't say it on an open line. So just to kind of think about how long, and frankly, I think the conversation long predates that. We go way back to military, not way back, but earlier days. And I agree that the conversation, the subtleties matter here. And so I think we really need to be careful and thoughtful about what descriptors we put on the types of activities, because we do want to be thoughtful about the impact those will have on the objectives that we're trying to reach. I remember when I left the government, John Holquist is not here, but I went to my first cyber war con, it was 2018. And I was just dumbfounded at the exquisite ability of private sector actors to attribute particular activities against a range of victims, whether they were parts of the United States government, elsewhere overseas. And so this idea that previously the idea of collecting intelligence and conducting attribution was uniquely the domain of the United States government or other governments was totally blown up. And I do think that, Dimitri mentioned and others have mentioned the indictments in 2014. So there is this, we're kind of evolving, but the objectives in the end haven't changed all that much. And so thinking about, are we trying to push back on the abuse of our infrastructure or others' infrastructure to reduce the economic harm that could be happening, the intellectual property theft, or are we trying to prevent physical harm to the United States? Does it matter in this conversation? I think that it may. So if you think about repositioning and Volt Typhoon, who we're going to engage in that conversation and the tools and tactics and techniques and procedures that we might ask industry are likely different than they might be in a ransomware incident, likewise, potentially. So I think one of the ways I think we can advance this conversation potentially is to take vignettes and say, okay, if we're responding to Volt, what do we think industry can bring to the table? If it's a ransomware incident, what do we think industry can bring to the table? And I know I don't want to steal Chris Painter's thunder later on, but we can't do this in isolation. We can't just be sitting here in our ivory tower in the United States with industry, as much as I love all of you. We have to be thinking about conducting and thinking through these problems with our partners and allies. We've been doing that, but I think we can do a better job. And in the end, we will have a longer term impact when we think through this collectively. So I have lots more to say, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. And I'm going to turn to Frank. I mean, I think both you and Kristen and really everybody on the panel has talked about the importance of defining the objectives, and that is the role of the government. And I'm thinking through, and that we can't be focusing on each iPhone that's locked up in a hotel room somewhere. We need to be thinking holistically. So Frank, I know you have some thoughts.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to pick up because really good points here. And the bottom line is we've let the adversary define our strategy. We're always reacting to something, and that in turn becomes our cyber strategy. And that is backwards, because at the end of the day, every actor is different from an adversarial standpoint. We need, and cyber deterrence, we talk about it, it's hard. You can't look at cyber deterrence in isolation of other deterrence writ large. And then at the end of the day, what dissuades, deters, or compels Russian activity is going to be very different than North Korea, which is going to be different than Iran, which is going to be different than China. So ultimately, I think what we're asking is, when can we get to the point that we can have discriminate, discrete, precise, and focused strategies around different actors in a way in concert, there's an umbrella that just makes sense. Right now, I feel like we're always reacting to whatever someone else does. And that in turn becomes our strategy. And I lived a lot of this in a post 9/11 environment. We let Al-Qaeda define our counterterrorism strategy to one extent or another. When it comes to nation state actors, however, we have other instruments, we have other tools, we have other, and I'm all in on working with our adversaries, whether it's our Five Eyes to start with. And quite honestly, we're working exceedingly well there. But I do think we've got to get to combined operations with others like Japan, like Jordan, like Israel, like South Korea, countries that are in tough neighborhoods that don't necessarily fit in that Five Eye environment or in the NATO environment. So we've got to figure out how we work with some of these entities. And then at the end of the day, every adversary is going to have its own playbook. And I just am shocked that we're acting surprised when we get kicked in the most obvious place and we're trying to come up with a strategy. That's backwards. If we can try to get a little forward leaning on that, I think we could go a long way.
I agree completely with that. I also think that security responders have the added burden or challenge now that we didn't have in 2015 of having to do all of that against a new privacy compliance backdrop. The biggest companies have all made a lot of commitments about working within European data boundaries, but we didn't have GDPR and compliance costs and regulatory requirements around data compliance that we have now. And so, particularly for smaller companies, thinking about data and access to data means that, and I've talked to lots of smaller security companies or companies that don't have big security teams, and they just wall off data. They don't make it available. So how we think about access to logs, access to forensics, getting that information available becomes much harder in a post-GDPR world. And so that's also on the table. It's using AI and ML and getting people comfortable with the metes and bounds of privacy law to make those analytics actually work in the scenario Frank's laying out.
And we can't let CISA 2015 expire. That's got to be reauthorized. Cynthia
Preach.
Kaiser had a great piece in that, but that would set us back a decade.
Rob, I want to bring you back into the conversation. And, one of the things that I think that the last few comments have elucidated is that we're here talking about cyber responses to cyber threats, but we need to broaden the conversation. There's a whole range of tools that can be brought to bear to respond to cyber threats, and cyber responses might not be the right response. So we'd love your take on that.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would disagree that, we have a military, we should use them for military missions. We have an IC, and we should get them engaged in, IC missions. And we have also, diplomatic levers and commercial levers and, all that sort of thing. We probably have some different stakeholders in the room and on the stage or whatever, if we want to fully get into that. But everybody, I think we just stipulate, use those tools, right? With respect to cyber, per se, because there are scenarios where we'll want to use a sort of intra-domain response, cyber on cyber, not necessarily the sort of first, the first thing, but it's part. The thing that I want to make sure that we're not doing is sort of arguing, today against a straw man, which does crop up all the time in this conversation, which is if we do a sort of a disruption activity, that is going to be dispositive. And it's all right, well, we've targeted, Vanguard, Panda, Volt, Typhoon, they're gone. That's not realistic. It's not practical, right? So from my point of view, when I've advocated and when CrowdStrike's advocated that we sort of increase the tempo of operations to, target threat actors and their infrastructure, it's not with the idea that it's just sort of a one and done. It's with an idea that as a community, every time we do these disruptions, it's some artisanal blend of people and skills and authorities and stuff like that. And it happens at random intervals, every few months or something. It's or, a few times a year, there's a press release that comes out from the FBI or something, you get an indication about something, a press report through NSA/CCC or the under advisement to something for Cybercom. The thing that we've always advocated for is is there any natural limit? Is it really the case that people in the private sector wouldn't want to do, there's even the people in this room, right? It's we all have sort of a hand on a lever somewhere. It's do you not want to do 10 of those a year? How about 10 a quarter, right? How about 10? What is the limitation stopping there? And I really think it's a coordination problem, and it's sort of an initiative problem. So let's turn the, turn the dial up to 11 on doing that stuff. Maybe not right away. Maybe it's not practical to try and aim to do, 150 of them in the sort of second half of 2025, but there is no reason why we shouldn't be doing 2 or 3 or 5 times as many as that we've done over the, the past number of years. And if we do that, then what we're doing really is preventing adversaries from achieving scale. And this is the big problem, right? There's a ton of people in our community that's engaged in defense. The problem is that threat actors can create infrastructure, and then they can victimize many, many dozens of victims based on that over a long duration of time. It's not as bad as it used to be. There used to be reports all the time of oh, there's, this such a threat actor had an average, dwell time or whatever of 17 years. It's a joke, right? It's just but it was a year, 2 years, something like that. It's that's gotten a little bit better, but we should still get in the habit of saying all right, we've seen 2 or 3, instances of malicious activity that's coordinated around this thing. And that thing could be, in the criminal space, it could be botnet, or a forum of some kind people are using to coordinate, or it could be in the nation state context, it could be some, some sort of infrastructure, command and control infrastructure, for example. And just when we see a few examples of that, we should just take it down and just impose a cost on them to have to rebuild it, because it is getting more challenging over time. Often they have to steal crypto, they have to create new accounts, they have to, have engage different service providers to rebuild this sort of thing. And the reason it doesn't happen more frequently now is because there are kind of coordination problems. It's sometimes they're leveraging US infrastructure, or there's a concern or consideration around it, like equities or intelligence loss gain and that sort of thing. So someone in the government, I think, should like kind of say like, we're doing 10 this month. Like you, the stakeholders that have a point of view on which we're doing this month, like volunteer the 10 that you think, and it could be some combination of because they're especially severe, or because like the threats are especially severe, or because like opportunistically like this such an infrastructure is vulnerable because we can just talk with our friends at this CSP or this telecom provider or whatever and solve it, or there's a control panel of their, this happens sometimes for botnets that is accessible and taken down that way. And it's just like throw them in the conversation and then just start like mowing the grass, right? Just like start taking them down. And like that's where we've sort of lacked initiative in the community so far. And it's an easy problem to solve. Someone just needs to say like we'll solve it, like we'll be the people. And it doesn't, like from industry standpoint, it's like the sort of capability exists, from a coordination, standpoint exists within JCDC to do this. Like from my point of view, and I've told them this, that they should get more activist about that. But there are, there's NSA-CCC, there's under advisement and Cybercom, as I said before. FBI doesn't really have much of a structure sort of interface with industry, even though they're the ones that are doing a lot of these things from a sort of, threat response perspective, like authorities, like they're doing some of this stuff. So, but like JCDC could get all the folks in the room potentially and the industry people, and we could have that conversation, and we could just start doing it more if we're inclined for it. Right?
Sign me up. I'd love to join the disruption task force, but the one caveat is that the government has to be willing to let go of trying to bring every case to justice. Because if the ultimate goal is to put handcuffs on, we're never going to get there. If we're going to mow the lawn, let's mow the lawn, and let's just disrupt actor after actor after actor. If the penultimate goal is criminal cases, we'll never get there. These are asynchronous actors going after opportunistic targets. We have to start acting opportunistically too. If the outcome is criminal prosecution, we're never going to get there.
Megan, I'm going to turn to you and then open up for questions right after that. But you served in the quintessential coordinating role of the NSC. That is like that is what people do at the NSC is coordinate. How feasible is this? How feasible is it for the government to coordinate this kind of action? And should the government be in this role?
I think the government should be in the role. Should they be the only person in the role? No, I think, well, yes and no. So can I have it both ways? I think, one of the things that we called for, and not to sound self-serving, with the Institute for Security and Technology and the Ransomware Task Force, but we're still talking about ransomware. John Keefe and everybody else in the room who served in government probably was tired of us banging on the door and saying, we're from industry and we're here to help. And so we, in the task force, called for something called the Ransomware Threat Focus Hub that was supposed to be the external partner to the Joint Ransomware Task Force. Joint Ransomware Task Force exists, as much as we haven't heard much from it lately. I think there are areas where we have authority and opportunities to bring this conversation together between industry and government. I absolutely agree with Rob that it would be great to start mowing the lawn, but what we've seen, particularly in the ransomware space, is we're still back to these old problems of we threw information over to the government, but the government hasn't responded. So one of the questions that we've talked about is like, yes, the government should be there, but they have a lot of work to do. As much as I love, all of you in the room who were there, we continue to struggle with some of these policy challenges around the role that the private sector plays in, particularly when they're partnering with the FBI, for example. We have this we're in a law firm, we have this pesky thing called the Fourth Amendment. So there are some of these challenges that we are still struggling with that are, I think, limiting our ability to maximize collaboration between industry and government. But to get through them, we have to be a little bit more willing to have some real specific conversations and take a few risks. But we have seen success in when we've undertaken some of those risks. Scattered Spider is back, but we've seen some, there was, for a period of time, a great degree of collaboration in that space. Things, I think, have not been so great lately, but what can we take from that experience, work on it, and scale it so that we can not have what some of us might call whack-a-mole, but rather a long-term, if it's joint sequenced operation, campaign that leverages the information, the exquisite information, as I was saying when I walked into to WarCon, that industry can build And particularly when you bring multiple industry players into the room and say, you know what, this is our target. Let's build a campaign against this. That can't be a violation of the Fourth Amendment. I'm sorry, but like, so we can get into the nuances, but that is an issue that we do need to come to the table and talk about with some specifics, as opposed to, as somebody was saying a minute ago, the boogeyman. We can do this. We've done this in old contexts. The government did. Now the government has the ability, because it's not in the only intelligence collection space, to leverage this information that industry has had to not just defeat what we did, terrorists, but actually go after these greater threats like ransomware and others that are holding us at risk. So we just need to have some greater conversations about it.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up now for questions. Emphasize again the word questions. We have a microphone that will come around. Raise your hand if you have a question for the panelists, please.
Hi, Tim Starks from Cyberscoop. Questions for Frank and Kristen specifically, but if anybody else wants to weigh in, of course, I'm interested. But Frank, you talked about active defense versus hacking back. I wanted to see if you could get a little more concrete about what you mean by what would be the difference, what would be the line, what would be an example of active defense versus hacking back. And Kristen, you mentioned that range of examples of hacking back that different people mean different things by. Are some of those more viable than others? Things like exfiltrating or others? Which would be the most examples that would be the most viable options to you?
I'll start. Thank you, Tim. And when you look at the various instruments, tools, tactics, techniques, and procedures that would fit in that active cyber defense bucket, they're manifold. So everything from beaconing data, if you want to be able to basically track where data is going, to obviously anything on your system. I think everyone would agree you're pretty much fair game to be able to be as proactive as you can. The question is, what's that? Rights and property. Rights and property, exactly. But the bottom line is on your system, there's a lot more. You have much more leeway in terms of what you can do. In terms of when you're looking, and I think Megan laid this out in very much the way I think about this, is instead of one-offs that you're reacting to, you have to flip the switch and take a campaign approach. And there you can partner with industry in a much more strategic kind of way, where you know what the end state is, you know what the goals are, you know what the rules of the road are, and you go forward and start doing so in collaboration. But when you look at the various tools, there are many technologically. I don't think technology is the issue here. It's obviously behavioral and some of the more delicate diplomatic sorts of issues that can get in the way. But when you're looking at active cyber defense, and we did a report on this about 10 years ago and laid out about 20 different steps that can be taken along that spectrum. Everyone immediately jumps to hack back or do nothing. The reality is, and I think Rob said this, that's a straw man argument. There's lots of steps in between there, some of which we're doing, but we do it one-off. It's onesies and twosies, not in a campaign-like approach.
Kristen.
Hey, Tim. So I gave 3 different options or ways in which companies could hack back: encryption, removal of the data, or destruction of the server on which it sits. I don't think any of those today are actual viable options for a victim of a cybercrime. However, victims of cybercrimes have the ability to use a seizure process. Imagine if our police forces got good enough, when our civil processes got good enough, that we could use digital seizure. And so we had a legal process by which the law enforcement was authorized to basically do a rapid deployment of something that would encrypt that data for you. You know, if the hackers can do it, so could the authorities. So if we had a process by which we could do that and then bring it to the court to allow the court to make the determination of legally how to then reclaim the data, work backwards through that process, that could be a really interesting way for victims to then go through and work backwards on how to make sure that their data is protected. We don't have our law enforcement teams resourced and skilled enough to be able to get to that state yet. But you can see places where we could. So is hacking back an option today? Is a digital civil seizure a process that could exist in the future? Absolutely. And so it's something that we need to be thinking about as tools for us as attorneys and those of us that live in this space, think about how do we evolve this space to help us create the next evolution of what do we do here.
Other questions?
Hi, Cynthia Kaiser, former FBI, recently moved to private sector. So, I think the questions I have going through my head are, what is the easiest way to start doing this instead of kind of thinking about it in terms of like, we have China, we have Russia, we have proxies, we have all this together. And if we don't kind of have these small steps that we're able to take towards it, I'm not sure we're going to ever get there. And so I'm really interested in your kind of thoughts on that and thoughts on timing too, because I worry a lot on Gen AI and how it's going to complicate our abilities to actually do these operations really near term.
Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, my sense of this is that, like, I worry that we do too much like hand wringing and pearl clutching in this community about like the proxies and yada yada. And also, I worry that people are too like fixated on like kind of like a sense of fairness. Like it's my data. Like maybe we can encrypt it and then get legal process, and it could be like given back to me. And I just like I'm wary of any type of approach that doesn't sort of scale and doesn't adapt to meet the different types of threats. So that's why I've suggested, in my remarks earlier, essentially getting the 10 or 20 or 30 entities in a room that, have a point of view on this threat, how it's changing and how severe it is and what's most severe among it. And then just putting those threats in order and then just going after them from sort of top down, with an exception of if number 6 on the group's list is just like easy, it's just like a pickup game or something, you can just do it, then go ahead and do it. But like for the most part, just like go down from most severe threat to least severe threat. And that will have the advantage of at least making sure that like you don't have scenarios, which we have had and do have now, where there are specific threat actors that as a community we have a pretty good beat on, and they've been operating for 10 years using kind of the same thing. And it's just like, in some instances, like that thing is a TTP or whatever it evolves. It's not, straightforward to target them on that basis, right? But in some instances, it's common infrastructure. So it's just like, let's not, as a community, allow that common infrastructure to just be so, like so long, it's like got a driver's license or something like that, right? Like, it's just like, we have to get better about like just getting after that stuff and taking it down, and then not being like overly fixated necessarily even on who or whatever. I think that, the opening remarks this morning, I think there's something that we need to like think about as a community about like maybe it's not overly escalatory. It's like, especially if it's being used to attack us, to just go ahead and get after that. And then also like not being fixated on like, is the data recovered or, whatever else, to be sure it was deleted or something like that. Let's like make sure that we can like stop the bleeding, right? Just like get after it and then just cause the people who are doing it to have to like start from scratch again. And that creates opportunities for detection as well. So, we need to obviously be thoughtful about how we, like try and maintain visibility of these threats. I'm not saying just like go to be reckless about taking things down, but there's a way in which you can do this at a much higher tempo that we're doing it now, I believe.
Can I take a little different approach on that? And not that I disagree with anything Rob said, I agree with it all. But Cynthia, I mean, the predecessor to the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, JCDC, was JICPO, which was a Solarium Commission recommendation. I think in concept and theory, it is still sound, whether it's JCDC, whether it's the CCC at NSA, and we obviously need FBI's equivalent of all of that. Because at the end of the day, NSA and FBI are the two that can bring something really unique to the fight from an intelligence standpoint. So the question is, and I think JCDC gets a bit of a bad rap. I think it's good when you have a shield up like campaign. What it doesn't do well is day to day. And ultimately, the only way you get stronger is if you have day to day, you got to do the reps in the gym every single day, not just when the balloon goes up. That tends to be where we're okay. We let everyone know, we bring them in, we have a shield up sort of effort, all good, fine and good. But tomorrow, when you've got another threat adversary, there isn't that muscle tissue and that battle rhythm in place. So how do we make that more operational? Whether it sits at CISA or somewhere else, I could care less. The concept is ultimately who has the tools, the wherewithal to serve as the catalyst to bring that operational collaboration together. I think DoD has a role in this. I'm sure I'm in the minority here, but I think they do have a role in this. And certainly NSA's Cybersecurity Center can play a more active role in all of this. And I think they do, but right now it's largely focused on the defense industrial base. That's not the only sector we're worried about when you're looking at critical infrastructure. So how do you scale that? How do you expand that? And how do you make it work every day, not just when you have a bad day? That's the way I would frame it.
Megan, do you want to?
Well, I think, yeah, picking something that I think Rob mentioned, the idea of something that's attacking us. So I think that's one piece of it. But I think at the end of the day, and I know Stacey wants to wrap this up. So the point I would make is also that however we start, we need to make sure that we have an ability to measure impact. Is this working? How do we know? So is there some kind of reporting requirement that partners in industry will be taking that shows, okay, we looked for reflections of our actions across the space, as opposed to Microsoft sees one thing, but nobody knows what Google sees on this same action. So we did this in the terrorism space. We looked for reflections of actions taken across the range of capabilities that the government and now industry have to see and judge impact. I think it's also important, and so I will just say, to bear in mind the defense part of this. And by that, I actually mean what are we willing to do for those partners that we do invite into the arena with us? And also, we're in here in large part because, and this is the unwelcome point of this party, we have a market problem. We have an incentives problem. There is still too much opportunity for weak software to be shipped to market and maintained in the marketplace. So we also need to be thinking about how we're going to change that conversation as well.
Okay, so 3 great points to land on: incentives, reciprocity, how our public and private sector partners both going to benefit from whatever we decide to do. And then also metrics, how are we knowing whether or not we're being successful? And also, by the way, I was wondering how long it would take before someone talked about reauthorizing CISA 2015. We should have set a clock. Thank you, Frank. All right, thank you. Please, everybody, join me in thanking the panel. We will convene back here at 11:30. Please enjoy some coffee for a brief break. Thank you, Jen and panelists. All right, thank you everybody so much. So next we're going to hear from Michael Daniel, who serves as the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, a nonprofit that brings together leading cybersecurity companies to share threat intelligence and improve global defenses. Since taking on this role in 2017, Michael has helped transform how the private sector collaborates to address cyber threats at scale. Before that, he spent nearly 2 decades in government service, including 5 years at the White House as special assistant to the president and cybersecurity coordinator at the National Security Council. In that role, he led the development of U.S. cybersecurity policy, coordinated responses to major cyber incidents, and worked to strengthen partnerships between government, industry, and international allies. Earlier in his career, he served at the Office of Management and Budget, where he oversaw the national security budget and helped align resources with emerging cyber priorities. Throughout his career, Michael has been a leading voice on how to balance security, innovation, and resilience in the digital age, and he continues to shape the way government and industry work together to tackle evolving threats. Please join me in welcoming Michael to the stage.
Well, thank you, Stacy, and thanks for inviting me to talk this morning. I think, we're in one of those unusual spaces where largely Dimitri, myself, and Frank are all agreeing. That's a strange place to be. But I think it's because of the challenges that we face and the fact that a lot of what we've been doing has manifestly not worked. Now, the next panel you're gonna hear from is gonna be talking about offensive cyber tools. So I thought I would actually spend a little bit of time talking about what do we actually mean by offensive cyber operations? And that term is often hard to define. You actually heard some of the previous panel, Kristen Goodwin, talking about that. And part of the issue is that we use a lot of euphemistic language around it. And so oftentimes different types of activities get conflated into that space. But fundamentally, I think offensive cyber operations involve three elements. One is that the activity or effect that you're trying to achieve occurs on somebody else's device that's not yours, right? So it's the effect or activity occurs on a device or a network or a server or a box, whatever, owned by someone other than the person carrying out the operation. So if a telecommunication company blocks an actor from accessing its network, that's not an offensive cyber operation. They own it. If they take an action to delete malware on their own network, that's not an offensive cyber operation. They own the network. The second element is that the actor does not have the owner's permission to carry out the activity, right? That if the owner of the network or the device invites you in, you're kind of like a vampire, at that point. But if the owner invites you in, that is not an offensive cyber operation. And then the last piece is that the activity or effect is intended to cause damage or disruption of some kind. The damage or disruption can be permanent or it can be temporary. It could be to a combination of hardware, software, or data. But really, when you think about an offensive cyber operation, it has the intended effect of causing some sort of result, not just the theft of data, not just the theft of money, but an actual result that you can see, either a disruption of some kind or damage of some kind. So what does this mean in terms of other things that often get conflated with offensive cyber operations? Well, one of them is it's clearly not espionage, right? Because espionage is the idea that you're going to steal information. It's also not surveillance, right? It's not just acquiring information about a person or an organization, nor is it even operational preparation, what our military calls operational preparation of the battlefield. Now, the things that go into operational preparation of the battlefield might be a precursor to an offensive cyber operation, but in and of itself, it is not an offensive cyber operation. It might still be annoying to the country that discovers it or the organization that discovers that we're doing it, or that when we discover that China is doing it to us, but it is still not an offensive cyber operation in and of itself. I'll also note that offensive cyber operations they can take many different forms though, right? They can be overt, they can be clandestine, they can be covert, right? Sometimes you actually want the recipient to know that it was you that carried out the operation. Your nefarious bomb-making plans have been permanently deleted courtesy of the United States government. Hugs and kisses, love, Cyber Command, right? Sometimes you actually want the adversary to know that it was you that was carrying it out. Sometimes you might carry out the operation in secret, but you will acknowledge it if it is disclosed. That's what clandestine means, right? We try to keep it secret, but if it gets exposed, we will acknowledge it. As Chris Painter likes to say, oh, rats, that was a good cop. You caught me, right? And we will now fess up to it. Sometimes if you want to deny that it's you, even if it is you, that's what covert means. It means, nope, wasn't me, even if somebody else presents evidence that it was. That's what covert means. And which type you want, which type of cyber operation you're going to do, depends on what goal you're trying to achieve. And offensive cyber operations can take a lot of different forms at different levels. They can be strategic, they can be tactical. You can target criminals or nation states. You can have impacts from minimal to catastrophic. And I think the key thing is what the previous panel and Dimitri were already talking about this morning, which is that offensive cyber operations are not ends in and of themselves. They're a tool in the toolbox, and they have to serve some broader policy goal, whether that goal is law enforcement, national security, or whatever. Now, I think part of the issue is why are offensive cyber operations so controversial? And I think there's a few pieces to this. One is almost all of our cyber capabilities grew out of the intelligence world. They emerged out of that space. And kind of like Fight Club, one of the first rules of intelligence operations is one doesn't talk about the intelligence operations, right? And so for years, we denied that we even had the capability to carry out offensive cyber operations, when manifestly we did. And it's only been in the last few years that we've actually finally realized that if you're actually going to use offensive cyber capabilities for deterrence, the bad guys kind of have to know what you're capable of. You know, we can now go back to Chris Painter and have a Dr. Strangelove reference, right? It doesn't do any good if the bad guys don't know that there's like this capability out there. I think and most countries today still don't admit that they have offensive cyber capabilities, even though most of them either do or could if they really wanted to. I think another reason that cyber operations are so controversial is that their effects can be unpredictable. Even though we've gotten much better and much tighter at the control, when we had a lot of the debate in the sit room about particular operations, one of the biggest challenges we had was understanding exactly what the effects would be. And if you ask the military, can you tell me what will happen if I shoot this missile at this target? They can give you a pretty good estimate of the probability of hitting the target, the probability of killing the target, and the probability of collateral damage. The ability to do that for cyber operations is still not there. We have a much more difficult time defining the parameters of what will happen when we use these tools. And so it makes it a little bit scary on the part of policymakers to actually implement them if they can't understand what the effects will be. And then the last thing that's important to this conversation and what the next panel will be talking about is that the capacity to carry out all of these kinds of operations that we've been talking about is not, in fact, restricted to the government, right? The capability to, as is demonstrated daily by the ransomware attacks that are being carried out against us by cyber criminals. The capability to have and carry out offensive cyber operations is not just restricted to the government. I will submit to you that based on my time in government and what I've seen since, if we think that the government alone can carry out the kinds of operations we need to impose costs on the adversaries, that's not going to happen. So the real question is not whether the private sector plays a role in carrying out cost imposition on the adversaries. The question is, what role do we want the private sector to play? And I would argue that before we go all the way to sort of allowing private sector companies to strike back on their own, we should actually try to do what Frank Salufo was talking about, which is actually do that operational collaboration at speed, at scale. Because I would argue that we actually haven't gotten all the way there yet. So we haven't even seen if that works. And that we need to give that a try first before we go any further down this road. So with that, I think it's a good way to segue into our next panel. Thank you for letting me come and talk to you this morning.
Thank you so much, Michael. If I could get our next set of panelists to join me on stage. Our guests this go around will examine the wide range of tools available for offensive cyber operations, from disruption to deterrence, and how policymakers should think about their use in different contexts. Moderating this panel is my colleague, Caitlin Clark. She's Senior Director in Cybersecurity Services here at Venable, seasoned policymaker whose career spans senior roles in both government and the private sector, including leadership positions at the White House and FEMA. a special assistant to the president and senior director for cyber and emerging technology at the National Security Council. She led interagency and international coordination on defense-related cybersecurity policy. Her tenure as chair of the Cyber Response Group saw her oversee federal responses to major cyber incidents involving critical infrastructure and international partners. Caitlin's blend of tactical incident response expertise, strategic foresight, and deep grounding in the digital economy equips her to guide today's conversations with clarity and authority. Thank you all so much for joining us. Over to you.
Is this working? Thank you, Stacy. And Stacy and I did not plan our outfits today, if anybody wanted to ask. As Stacy said, I'm Caitlin Clark. Those of you guys who have been in meetings with me knows this when I kick it off and say, not that one. It still lands every single time. I am joined by three incredible minds on cyber operations, cyber policy, and I'm going to introduce you all. So we're going to start to my left with John Keefe. He recently retired from NASA, where he was the director of cross-agency strategy integration. Prior to that, though, he was senior director for cyber policy at the National Security Council, where he was responsible for offensive cyber operations policy and cyber policy engagements with our foreign partners. He was a senior executive at the National Security Agency for 15 years, serving as the director, senior advisor on strategy, the senior strategist in NSA's Tailored Access Operations Unit, and NSA's Cybersecurity Directorate. Next to John is Morgan Adamski, a senior executive at the National Security Agency. She recently served as the highest ranking civilian and a key member of the leadership team at the U.S. Cyber Command. She led the Department of Defense initiatives aimed at swiftly integrating technology for operational outcomes, incorporating artificial intelligence for both offense and defensive cyber operations, and fostering robust public-private partnerships to guard against cyber threats. She recently departed public service in July and now serves as a U.S. cyber leader at PricewaterhouseCoopers. And last but not least, Josh Stiefel is Vice President for Government Affairs at Second Front, a defense tech firm focused on accelerating technology delivery to the warfighter. He also serves as the co-chair of the recently announced Commission on Cyber Force Generation, a joint effort between the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Until this past June, he served as a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee for nearly 7 years and was responsible for all aspects of cyber warfare and IT activities in the annual National Defense Authorization Act. So as you can see, we have the people to talk around about cyber offense policy and where we go from here. But I'm going to start with a question that we just heard to the previous panel. And it's really around terminology. We've heard a lot of terms in the space. We've already heard them this morning: active cyber defense, offensive cyber, hacking back, cyber-enabled operations. Let's start with you, John. What are we actually talking about when we talk about offensive cyber, and how do you view the spectrum of activities that are possible?
Can you all hear me? All right, excellent. So I'm going to pick up on this question using the terminology that we used when I was at the NSC. First, offensive cyber in general meant having a disruptive or destructive effect using cyber tools in almost all instances. This is nation state, this is US government entities using the government-owned and government-controlled tools to achieve policy outcomes. So that Cyber Command is the canonical case, but of course there are elements of the intelligence community that have similar capabilities. I will confess I am intrigued by the possibility of using private sector entities to achieve disruptive or destructive effects, but I'm going to talk about this a little later in the panel. I think of this in very narrow circumstances when it comes to ransomware. This question of hackback I think is intriguing, but it's almost a non-starter. At first, I always think it conveys the idea of the private sector rolling into, you've experienced a cyber intrusion, and now the Network Operations Center is going to roll into action and try to trace back to the original perpetrator. The possibility of that happening I think is almost zero, in part because criminals and nation states are clever about obfuscating their path back to the target. And so good luck trying to hack back directly. Hackback also, to me, conveys a sort of a time urgency. Either the intrusion's ongoing and you're trying to hack back, or within a couple days you've lost some data and you're trying to go find that data on the internet. It's not something that happens a year later. And then active cyber defense, I think, is actually the grayest term, because I've heard some of our foreign partners use the term, but that's just a polite phrase for offensive cyber operations. And then there's some of the private sector uses the term. There's legislation, the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act, which provides some top cover for either gathering information on behalf of law enforcement and passing over to law enforcement, or taking defensive measures to protect your networks from further intrusion. So anyway, those are the basic differentiations that I would typically have used when I was at the NSC.
Morgan.
So I think, John did a good job of laying out all the Ds, right? Degrade, disrupt, deny. That's the outcome you're seeking to achieve against your adversary with offensive cyber operations. The techniques and the tactics that you use to do that are bound. Like, people come up with different types of things. That's innovation. What's the capability? I think the discussion that we've really been having from an offensive cyber capability perspective is just, how does that fit into the larger toolbox of all the things you're trying to accomplish? I've had quite a few conversations over my career when people think of offensive cyber operations. First, they gasp that you said it out loud. Don't say that word. But second piece of it is, it's not a Hollywood movie, right? Like, I think that's the main point we have to focus on. It is a capability, a technique or a tactic where you are trying to achieve an outcome, which is degrade, deny, disrupt an adversary's ability to have data, capability, intent. And then how does that fit into the larger outcome that you're trying to achieve from a campaigning perspective? It is one tool. And so it may do X, it may degrade or disrupt data or infrastructure or something those lines, but that is part of a larger plan, a larger conversation of what are we trying to achieve against our adversaries from a national perspective. So it can be a bunch of different things. However, the outcome is always the same, and the scope and what they're trying to achieve is kind of constant.
Josh, your thoughts? Any different from what Morgan and John, how Morgan and John view it?
I would also say it's sitting next to you is different than sitting across the table being asked a lot of questions by you. just to be clear.
Feel free to
Quite
ask
awesome.
questions.
You're like,
We're on the other side now. Let's do it.
I just think it's so interesting that, the time we're spending talking about what do we mean when we say cyber, like, I'm pretty sure everyone in this room is going to agree that that's a podium, right? We can't even get on the same page within the United States government about what we mean when we're talking about this, right? I'm sure a lot of work went into developing the NSC's definition of offensive cyber, much like a lot of hours were spent thinking about, the definition of offensive cyber that's published in, JPUB 3 TAC 12 that the Joint Staff puts out. And then, you have joint doctrine, and then the services might come up with their own definition of it. The fact that we can't even agree is just, it's an amazing kind of conceptual dilemma we find ourselves in.
So you're saying words matter, Josh?
I'm saying I'd like to get past the point where we're debating what a definition is and just get to the action itself.
So let's talk about the action. So John, to the extent that you can you explain the current approach to how the current approach to cyber deterrence works, as far as you are aware?
My flippant answer is it doesn't. Now, Dimitri this morning raised a pretty good point, which is there are boundaries that adversary cyber actors continue to operate within. So you don't see broad social level disruptions, except possibly in places like Ukraine. However, at the NSC, we used to joke that no one's deterred in cyberspace right now, and we were referring to ransomware actors predominantly operating from Russia, and they operate sort of with impunity. The Russian government doesn't lift a finger against them. There's not a whole lot that U.S. law enforcement can do. These individuals operate beyond the reach of the law. Likewise, you can read about Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, and they're operating with impunity. They're discovered in U.S. critical infrastructure, and there's not really a particular significant response to that, other than a lot of public condemnation. Go back to the essential ingredients of cyber theory. What are those ingredients? You got objectionable behavior, you got credible capabilities for responding to that behavior, you've got some messaging about what is objectionable and what you're going to do about it, and then you have to have a willingness to act. So in theory, if you impose sufficient costs on cyber actors, they'll back down. That might be achievable against individual criminals. Against nation states, I think was Kristen's point. Nation states are the entities, the hacker entities. I came from a hacker entity. I could tell you we were not going to be deterred by anything. We had a mission assigned. We are going to go out and accomplish the objectives that we were responsible for. I think that that probably applies to both the PRC and Russian state cyber actors. So that you have to, again, you have to figure out what outcome you're trying to get to get to some level of deterrence. In general, in the case of ransomware, the simple outcome you're after is make them stop. In the case of PRC cyber intrusions into U.S. critical infrastructure, same objective, make them stop. But I think the calculus there is much more complicated because a government is not going to give up so easily. Ransomware actors, they're in it for the money. That is something that you can work, but I don't think that you're actually going to stop them from trying to make money. You might stop them in their selection of targets.
So go ahead.
I just build
Maura.
off something that John said. I think one of the most, one of the things that John really emphasized, and speaking for you, John, so correct me if I'm wrong, is, not all cyber operations are deterrable. I mean, that's the one thing we have to think about is that, to John's point, if there's an objective and outcome that our adversaries are seeking to achieve and they have a mission to accomplish, they're going to keep doing what they're doing. Our job is to really have a conversation about how hard are we making it for them to be successful? What are we doing to make them stop doing what they're doing or understand where our red lines are? And I think that's going to, I'm not going to get into the red line conversation. I'll defer that back to the policy experts. But I think that that's one of the key things that we're trying to emphasize when you talk about pre-positioning in U.S. critical infrastructure on things like ports and things that we truly care about, right? That's our civilian infrastructure. That's something that really matters. That's an activity from like a deterrable perspective we really want to focus on. Mass espionage against the telecommunications sector, that's something that's really hard to do when you're talking about intelligence organizations. Do we want to make it harder on them? Absolutely. Do we want them to stop? Absolutely, because that's our data and things we want to protect. But if that is their mission and outcome that they're seeking to achieve, it's going to be very hard to deter them, but it's on us to make it really, really hard for them to keep going.
So we just talked about making it really, really hard to keep going. And today we're having a conversation about private sector as part of that conversation. Morgan, how did we even get to this point of considering private sector and imposing costs on adversaries?
Yeah, so I think we have to take a step back, right? In Michael's speech, he was talking about the fact intelligence agency is really foundation, bedrock of a lot of that activity. The National Security Agency is close to 75 years old, right? And you've got the Central Intelligence Agency older than that. U.S. Cyber Command, like 15. Okay, if you've got kids, you've got to kind of understand what 15 means, but 15, okay? And so, unfortunately, there's some aspect of like time, patience, and continual advocacy for them to be successful. The fact of the matter is that you've got to build talent, you've got to build capabilities, you've got to build infrastructure, you've got to build processes. And U.S. Cyber Command has spent a significant amount of time working to do that through the great support that it's gotten from its overseers. But it still takes time and effort to be able to recruit and train and retain that talent. And that's a lot of the challenges that we're in. And so when you talk about the private sector engaged in these various spectrum activities and the discussion around whether industry should be supporting offensive cyber operations, I also think it's really important to think about it in different buckets, right? Industry supporting offensive cyber operations, some of the conversations around how do they augment capacity, right? Whether as contractors or over the responsible oversight of the government, because they're inherently, doing inherent government functions, that's a discussion. Giving them authority to act independently, that's a discussion, right? So there's multiple different buckets here, but the fact of the matter is, we want to be able to produce operations and capabilities in support of the administration's goals, but to be able to do that, U.S. Cyber Command's 15 years old, they're doing a ton of work there, but like, how do we leverage the expertise of industry, the capabilities, and the understanding of of the infrastructure we're trying to operate on to better make our operations more successful, be able to move faster? And that's the conversation I think we're trying to have is what is the framework that needs to exist to be able to leverage industry in some of these conversations, which have inherently been classified, closed off conversations, so that we can be successful and achieve the outcomes that we're all trying to do, which is secure our nation's infrastructure.
Josh, you spent a lot of time in Congress thinking about some of these issues. particularly on, I think US Cyber Command and those, as Morgan just talked about, its resourcing. Do you see the private sector in this mission as a stopgap or something that will continue on?
So I really like the comparison Morgan made about a 15-year-old. If my 15-year-old doesn't know how to walk, I'm going to have a lot of questions, right? At 15, you know how to walk, you know how to write essays, you know how to do all these things. Our 15-year-old hasn't spoken a word yet and is still crawling on the floor. When we're talking about the stopgap that is the private sector, I think about, we're here because of a failure of our system, of our community, right? I'm not part of it. We've all failed collectively to generate the capacity that is inherently a government function, such that we have to talk about the private sector as part of this because of that failure that kind of looms in the background of the conversation. And so, is there a role for the private sector? Absolutely. When it comes to cyber operations, no different than any other military discipline, no different than operations in any other domain, right? The Navy does not operate unilaterally by building its own ships, right? There's an defense industrial base that supports that and builds capacity towards that. There is a role for the private sector that shouldn't be us reinventing the wheel here. This should be us thinking about how do we do things in these other domains. We're pretty good at it. We can build an aircraft carrier that operates with no lights on and have planes that have no lights on landing on in the middle of the ocean. We're capable of incredible things. And so, knowing that, hey, we shouldn't have to depend on the private sector to fill this gap. We ought to be doing this. We will need the private sector, but, we have to kind of look at our own history here and say, how have we solved these problems before?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just want to add one point here to your question. How did we wind up here? In my mind, we're having this conversation today because a lot of the tools that we might have used previously don't appear to work that well, especially against these two groups that I think Rob Felden spoke to at the outset, which is ransomware actors and nation state cyber entities or operational units. And so economic sanctions, diplomatic dialogue, cybersecurity on defense, indictments, law enforcement arrests, publicizing the names and addresses of the perpetrators. Some of that has good effect, but it doesn't really slow down ransomware actors and nation state cyber intrusions into critical infrastructure. That's why we're talking about this today.
So we've heard a lot about this morning already about tools in the toolbox being used for particular policy outcomes. So, John, can you explain how you view the different tools that you just talked about a few of them, economic sanctions, naming and shaming. How do you view those particular tools in the toolbox? And does the type of actor, we heard 3 nation state, criminal and hacktivists this morning, does that matter as you're looking at the tool?
The short answer is yes. The type of actor you're up against very much shapes the response. At first, start with your outcomes. As I said before, usually you're starting with some variant of make them stop, whether it's ransomware criminals in Russia or PRC government entities doing cyber intrusions. So if you take that basic rubric of I'm trying to get them to stop, various tools will apply to those groups in different ways. In the case of ransomware actors, most of the tools that you would use are quite ineffective. That was our experience while I was at the NSC. And so that was why we were turning to ideas that were more aggressive, trying to, at the end of the day, ransomware actors are in it for the money. So if you're not impacting their bottom line, you're not really impacting them. And I can see Cynthia there, and God love the FBI for the efforts that they undertook, because they undertook quite a lot. But at the end of the day, it was still a trickle. They were impacting onesies and twosies, and there were a lot more ransomware actors out there. In the case of nation state actors, the policy tools get quite a bit more complicated. Are you willing, over cyber intrusions into critical infrastructure? Do you want to invoke economic sanctions? Do you want to sanction commercial entities? Do you want to engage in a diplomatic dialogue where you might not go anywhere? Or are you willing to touch something that the adversary values? That was a foundational question that we dealt with while I was there at the NSC. And the question in the case of PRC, what do they value? Should we go intrude into their critical infrastructure? Now you need a messaging campaign that says, by the way, we're in your critical infrastructure. Thanks for being in ours. That the PRC already assumes that we're there. And so this tool of cyber dialogue didn't appear to be particularly effective. But so you would have to touch things like, and the things that we just floated it. I'm waiting for the air to go out of the room when I say this, the Great Firewall. So both a cybersecurity device for the PRC government and a tool of social control. That was how you were going to get the PRC government's attention. A lot of the other stuff they weren't going to care about.
So you talked about ransomware actors. I'm going to bring up a phrase that has come to be raised a few times. Letters of marque. You talked about ransomware actors being financially motivated and about money. Can you talk to us about, I think when I think of letters of marque, I think of privateers in the War of 1812. Love pirate talk, but how does that actually apply when we're talking about the cyber domain?
I'm happy to take this one on. So we actually talked about this idea of letters of marque. It came out of conversations we had with the private sector, companies that we thought had the capabilities. When I talk about this whole concept, it was actually quite small. There's a handful of companies that hire the right people with the right set of skills to be able to go do this. And we were very much focused on the ransomware actors, and we had a very short list of individuals that we knew quite a bit about. And we were talking about how do we get after them and get after their money. And so that was what led to our sort of what I call a narrow letters of marque idea. And there were some rules that would go with it. It wasn't going to be wild, wild west. For example, the activities would have to be limited to Russia. So you couldn't go after third-party infrastructure and third nation infrastructure and things like that. But yes, we were starting with the outcome. We were trying to get relief delivered to healthcare systems in the United States and American school systems, school kids being impacted by the release of their records by ransomware criminals. That's struck us as an outrageous move. And we were trying to figure out what are we willing to do to make that stop.
So I think, John kind of touched on it, right? So in letters of marque conversation, you have to take all the considerations into play. You think about, it was brought up the fact attribution, right? A lot of operations are meant to hide attribution. And when we say that, that means things like how do we obscure infrastructure? How do we conceal our techniques? How do we ensure that we're not necessarily burning our capabilities, especially if we spent a significant amount of money on them from a US taxpayer perspective? And so the oversight and the coordination to be able to execute that does take a significant effort inherent to the government alone. When you add external entities, it's just going to take different types of levers and pulls that would have to be put in place. And quite honestly, when you talk about things like attribution, like things happen in cyberspace, we all know that. Technology changes, AV software is updated, things are caught that were no longer, that weren't caught before. And so those create scenarios where now you're potentially having to answer to another foreign government and potentially on an activity that you may know nothing about. And so that gets very complex, even at a government level. And so the more entities you pull into that, and there's extensive coordination efforts that already exist. And so I think there's things like that, not to mention the liability aspect of it. I know I see lawyers in the room, so I'm just going to say liability and hope that covers me. But those aspects are completely different, right? If it has an unintended consequence that you weren't really anticipating, you did something or something happened on the technology or the infrastructure that you just weren't planning for. That's something that has to come into consideration. Now, from a pros conversation or just from a, you got to look at both sides of the coin on this, right? There is a capacity thing that you're operating in, with, and through infrastructure that is owned by the private sector. You're operating on technology that was developed by them. And so having conversations and their ability to be able to operate there to better understand it, like there's a capacity augment technical expertise again that comes in that conversation. So that all of those considerations have to come into play in that discussion.
We've heard already today the conversation, I'm looking right at Frank, on operational collaboration. And I think what you're talking about is really about operational collaboration. We've heard about I mean, there's an alphabet soup of private public coordination centers in the government. We've heard a few of them today. JCDC, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the NC3 that you worked at
Never heard it
NSA.
called it the NC3.
Sorry.
I like that.
C3,
All right. So I was like, that's
National-
nuclear
I got
command
it
control,
wrong.
by the way. That is not what we did.
There's another NC. Yeah, there's another NC3. Yeah, there's my point being is a cybersecurity collaboration center.
Yeah.
NSA's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. That's where the N came in my head. It's early. The point being is that there's a lot of public-private collaborative centers in the U.S. government, and even many in the cybersecurity space. We talked about, and I think many panels have talked about how important it is to coordinate the activities of government and private sector as we think about offensive cyber capabilities and campaigns. Where do you think that could be occurring? Where is it occurring now, and where could it be?
I will offer, at least from the NSA Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, and my experience is that a majority of those forums that you just named were set up to discuss cyber defense of critical infrastructure, defense of the defense industrial base, other sectors, right, using the ISACs. That's where a lot of that collaboration is occurring. When you talk about all offensive cyber operations, it is likely, and it is, a most different set of entities. And a lot of those conversations are happening behind closed doors because, as everyone has already talked about, when you talk about the techniques or the capabilities that are used in those type of operations, that's the secret sauce. That's what's trying to be protected. And so it's not to say that the current forums couldn't fill that basis if that's what's required. It just wasn't the original intent. And so there would have to be a discussion on how you continue to have those conversations. But most likely it would be a different set of entities and a different type of conversation. Now, what I will also offer is that I see a constant flow between cyber defense and cyber offense. The insight and the expertise and the knowledge and the activities that are happening on a daily basis, they're a constant cycle of each other. An incident happens, people want to understand who the adversary is, they want to understand what the response options are, they want to understand the opportunity, they potentially want to do something, and then that means we have to defend in case there's some type of retribution from whatever we did. So like the whole circle and the whole ecosystem needs to flow together. It can't be distinct and separate. It tends to be different types of conversations, different types of entities at different classification levels.
Josh, you talked about learning, like not reinventing the wheel. You talked about private sector already engaging with defense and other, domains. Is there something we can learn from there as we talk about it's different folks? How do you see that?
So I'm reminded of when I was at the Treasury Department and working with financial sector institutions. You would talk with the CIO, you would talk with the CISO of major financial institutions who'd say, yeah, absolutely. Like, let's go do this together. And then, they would check in with their general counsel, said, absolutely, expletive, not. Like, no, we're not doing that, right? And so sometimes the cyber community, we can really wrap ourselves around the axle just talking amongst ourselves without really factoring in how we exist often, and particularly in the private sectors, through the private sector lens, in support of a revenue generating side of a business, right? And so making sure that we aren't just trapping ourselves, in a room and having these good ideas, but thinking about, hey, where do we exist? How do we operate together collaboratively, in the interest of our shareholders, in the interest of our investors, in the interest of our, the taxpayers? How are we doing this together? And sometimes the emotional connection that we have to getting a response, to operating, to holding adversaries at risk is disconnected from, the legal constraints we operate under, with fiduciary responsibilities and what have you. So I think it's important to take that wider aperture view on this, because anyone who's been in this business for a while has seen we have the same conversations over and over and over again.
John?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to this idea of collaborating, public-private partnerships, collaborating on cyber defense, and Megan Stiefel made a reference to this in her session as well. So that the thing that strikes me as lacking on cyber defense, especially against ransomware, is that real-time collaboration. So my model for this is actually the National Reconnaissance Office. They will operate with individual companies on their watch floor to manage satellites in space, and so that sort of one of the things that impressed me about private sector efforts was how up to date and more expansive of a view of the cybersecurity world they might have than the intelligence agencies. So being able to sit down with them in real time to say, okay, here's our understanding of the problem, or for them to come to the government and say, here's a problem that a bunch of us are seeing, and then being able to share that information. That always felt like the ingredient that was missing, is this real time collaboration in a watch floor where that provides you all the connectivity you need to get back to your original companies, or original agencies. And so I just wanted to commend Institute for Security and Technology. They had talked to us about this idea of having some kind of collaboration forum, and JCDC might be the right answer, something like that. But this idea of real-time collaboration was the thing that we were trying to get to.
So I know we're nearing time before we can before we open up to the floor, but I have one more question, and it's kind of the nerdy one that Megan brought up earlier as well. How do we measure effectiveness? Like, as we take an approach, as we use a particular policy tool, how do we know it's making any difference? It's to anyone.
I think I heard the answer earlier. I'll just repeat it. But in the case of ransomware, you'll see a reduction of the amount of ransomware activity in the flow of dollars to ransomware actors. Again, predominantly in Russia.
I think the more comprehensive answer just is building off of that is it's a change in our adversaries' behaviors, right? It is a change in the way that they operate, a change in their infrastructure, a change in how they think about specific operations, a change in them potentially targeting specific entities. But again, that will go back to, like, if it is their mission and it is the outcome that they are directed to achieve, you may not see that without using a bigger hammer. And so, like, that is one thing you got to have to kind of think about, but it is a change in their behaviors.
If we are back here next year having the same conversation, right, we have failed, right? Like,
So
progress.
don't invite us back, pick other people.
No, I mean, I say that tongue in cheek, right? But that is the metric to know if we are successful. If we are having the same conversation year after year, we are not successful.
Does time horizon factor into this, though? Like, because I'm just going to be contrarian here. Like, how adversary behavior changing over what time frame, right? Because we have seen disruptive actions taken. There is a change in behavior for a period of time, and then they're back. So I think one of the things that I struggled with is, like, the time horizon of changing adversary behaviors, because you can make, point in time impact, and then it's back, as you talked about the mission and their objective.
I think one thing that plays into that, though, that I, tried to measure the capacity, at least in the defense side of the house, is just, they come back, right? To your point, they're going to come back, potentially use the same technique. But if they are literally exploiting the same vulnerability, using the same technique, and no one has changed any behaviors on the defensive side to be aware of it, cognizant of it, and ensure it doesn't happen again, they're going to keep being successful. So it's not necessarily they come back, but it's got to change the behavior. We have to change our behavior as well from a defensive perspective.
Got it. Go ahead, Jen.
You and I wrestled with this question while we were at the NSC. But I think that there's no such thing as one and done in this business, for sure. But even one sustained is never going to be done. And so, some people will call it whack-a-mole. There's an element of truth to that. I call it the shooting gallery. And you really, you're there for the fun of it. That's picking up on Kristen's theme of there's emotional satisfaction of getting the adversary to adjust behavior. But I don't know that you're going to actually drive them out of this business. And again, I'm talking both nation states and criminal actors. That in the case of ransomware actors, the real change is the Russian government has to take action and decide that they're not going to tolerate that behavior from their territory, and that will solve part of it. But then that'll just drive the actors to some other territory, and they'll operate secretly for a while until they're discovered, and then they'll move on again.
So you're in the Josh camp of, if we are still discussing this next year.
We will be,
our
hopefully in a
veterans
different form.
expect. I just wanted to lay the groundwork that we're probably still discussing this, Josh, next year. So, because it sounds, from
I'm
all the
not-
speakers today, we've
I
been
wish I
speaking
were
about it
paid
for 10
by a
years.
panel that I appear on, because then that would, be great for me. But, I see just how far we've come. I mean, who remembers how big 3D TVs were 10 years ago, right? Are we still talking about that? No. Like,
Mhm.
when it comes to technology, we are moving at this unbelievable speed. But for some reason, when we're talking about other nation states and our own activities, we are comfortable still with the same debate, today that we were 5 years ago. Like, that's a mark against us, I think, as a community.
Or as I think Frank said, 10 years ago now. So the debate is 10 years old. Cyber Command is 15 years old, and we are in the fun tween teen years on both conversations. Questions from the audience? If you could say who you are.
Sure. Elliot Fopp, private sector now, but government for a while. I think, could you all talk about outputs versus outcomes? Because I think a lot of the conversation over the last 6 months has kind of shifted less about the long term. I mean, the outcomes are kind of an expectation based on more outputs being seen from the US side. Like, I know in Brandon and I think Ari both got the hackback question when they gave testimony to Congress. I think members of Congress, when there are power vacuums, get very, very antsy that we're not doing enough, that they're not seeing public action being taken. So where do you all fall in terms of, a lot of the conversation, I think today, Rob hit some points, Dimitri's points about there just needs to be more operational collaboration, more outputs, obviously all serving the same preferred outcome, but where do you all fall in terms of seeing more output?
I'm going to be in the camp of outcomes are more important than outputs. So I think that there's a natural evolution. I'll just counter that. Yeah, Cyber Command is 15 years old, but I think the first time I went back and looked, 2018 was the first time, or the NDAA, that we first named offensive cyber capabilities with authorities and capacity and building. So I'm going to shorten that 15.
Shorten that, yeah.
But the natural conversation for those of us that have been in this world is, do more. Okay, more of what? Great. All right, I've done more. And then the next part of the conversation is, okay, would you actually accomplish? Was it effective? Were you successful? So like the outcomes conversation is really where I think we need to center ourselves, because it doesn't matter how many operations or things we do. If we're not actually achieving the outcome, all we're doing is wasting cycles, capacity, and capability. And so if I'm answering your question correctly, I think that's where I think we have to focus on. Now, there is goodness in outputs. It helps us get reps and sets in terms of training, certifications, building the capacity that we need, because you don't want to just wait for that one big thing and not have any ability to build up to it from a training perspective. So there's goodness in outputs. It's just, I think a lot of the conversation now is centered on outcomes.
I think both are really important. But the question behind what you asked, Elliot, is, do we have the capacity to create outcomes or outputs? Right. And that's the thing that I have a lot of questions about, is, are we building on a persistent basis the capability, the capacity to allow someone to make a decision of, I care about outcomes or I care about outputs. Right. And there's a lot, I think, of potential that we haven't seized or leveraged yet.
And I'll jump in on this one too, because I think this is a good question. I'm going to agree with Morgan. The outcomes are actually the more important thing, but I take your point that you're implicitly touching on, which is it feels like the adversary actors should feel the pressure, and it doesn't. At least when I was there, it didn't feel like they were feeling a lot of pressure, and so that speaks to I needed to move at a higher op tempo. And again, in the case of ransomware actors, having the private sector who could bring additional capacity without reallocating government resources, there was an appeal in that. And so I think the output in speed of operations, some of the innovative thinking that private sector was prepared to bring to some of these problems, again, keeping my comments to the ransomware actor crowd, I think they're to a degree outputs is not a bad way to think about it, at least until to the point where you're creating pressure on the actors. After that, it's all about the outcomes.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thanks. I'll probably ask a very immature question. So I was in tailored access for many years. And when we were there, there were times when we wanted to do things and we couldn't. And I'm looking at everyone facing me, and this is really awkward for me to be behind Mike. And part of the reason was lawyers. And we're in the room having the same conversation year after year after year because all the lawyers need to get their words in and say, my definition is better than your definition. And I guess my question is, how do we get to a spot where we are comfortable taking the risk necessary to achieve these desired outcomes that the three of you have been talking about? Because it seems like every time there's an idea, 10 people say this is a terrible idea. Let's just not take action and we'll see you next year at the next conference.
Well, I'll just say this sitting in a law firm. I will say that I have found that when you involve your legal counsel at an operational level on a frequent basis, it really does help these conversations. And what I mean by that is showing them, like, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Here's what I'm trying to do. Here's the risk. Here's not the risk. Like involving them in engaging conversation versus asking them in question and email that's like, hey, I want to do this. Do you approve? That never goes as far. And so I will just say that from a legal perspective, like I've been very successful in building strong relationships with legal teams because we've involved them from day one in the entire process. But I'll just touch on that from a legal perspective. Josh is just waiting to go.
Despite what a lot of people think, I'm actually not a lawyer. But some of the best advice I ever got was, from a former boss and mentor of mine who said, when an attorney says, oh, we can't do that, that's illegal, say, okay, show me where in the law it is, right? I think too often on the operational side, we talk to our counsel and they say, you can't do this. And you say, okay, great, I'm going to move to this other option. No, I mean, it can be a conversation because so much in the law is interpreted, right? And it's so interesting how the plethora of space law that's been developed in the last, 15, 20 years, cyber law still is so undeveloped because there hasn't been a lot of case law that's been built up around it. There hasn't been a lot of precedent around it. So when an attorney asserts an opinion about something, there's absolutely room for interpretation and objective opinion to say, hey, how do we go do this? We can't do that. Okay, why? How come? Right? We often just take it at their word when, let's just admit, this is new to everyone, including the attorneys.
And I'm going to agree with Morgan and Josh, but I'm, for the person that asked the question, I get what you're getting at. I think Rob Sheldon used the phrase hand wringing and pearl clutching. There's a lot of it that goes on in this arena, and none of these policy tools that we use, to include the simple ones like law enforcement actions or economic sanctions, those are never quite as simple as you might say. And there is a lot of there's a lot of hand wringing that goes on even in those discussions, and none of this comes with zero risk. So that, in my mind, if you're trying to solve this problem on behalf of U.S. healthcare systems or school systems across the United States, that, sitting on your hands, continues the risk that all of those entities are carrying. U.S. government has to get off of its hands and take some action, and that entails taking some risk.
We have time for one more question. Anyone?
Because we're between you and lunch right now.
I swear I always get the session between people and their food.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, guys, please join me in thanking the panel. We are entering that part of the day for lunch. We have about an hour. Please come back to the room by 1:25, where we'll be joined by Sandra Joyce, Head of Threat Intelligence at Google. Thank you so much. See you in a bit. All right. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. So much. I'm so excited to see that this room is still packed, if even more so than it was the first half of the day. I'm super excited for the second half of our program. Please join me in welcoming Sandra Joyce. She's the Vice President at Google Threat Intelligence at Google Cloud, one of the most respected voices in global cyber threat intelligence with decades of experience tracking and countering advanced adversaries. Sandra, a dear friend, colleague, and mentor, is also a highly respected cybersecurity leader with nearly 3 decades of experience in the intelligence community. As head of Google Threat Intelligence since 2022, following Google's acquisition of Mandiant, she oversees threat research and operations at one of the world's leading incident response organizations. Under her leadership, Mandiant became widely recognized for its ability to track nation-state actors, attribute some of the most high-profile intrusions over the last decade, and deliver actionable intelligence to governments and corporations alike. She has advised Fortune 500 companies, policymakers, and international partners on defending against advanced adversaries, and her contributions have helped shape how the global cybersecurity community understands and responds to threats. Sandra, thank you so much for being with us today. Turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stacy, who's a dear friend, mentor, and colleague as well. And I want to thank Venable for the opportunity to speak today. Many of us have been in this industry for quite a while. Some of us on the national security side, some of us in the cyber intelligence side. But I would say that if you wanted to grade us on effort, I'd give us an A+. We've worked tirelessly. We've had time away from our families. We have been hard at work for a decade. But I'm afraid that if you wanted to grade us on outcomes, I think that the grade would be less than an A. And that's disappointing for the amount of effort that we put in. Because by almost every measure, the cybersecurity threat landscape is actually worse. There's ransomware is up, intellectual property theft is up. Our M-Trends report showed that while maybe the number of espionage incidents has gone down, the sophistication has actually gone up. We've seen threat actors get God mode in some of the most ubiquitous systems in our government, and we don't even know for a long time how they even got in. So I think that when we think about it, the situation has worsened, and we probably have to do a little bit of an evolution. So I want to start out with saying part of this is not necessarily just our fault. The adversary is very resilient, right? Chinese cyber espionage actors are backed by an ecosystem of contractors, of intelligence services, academics, private researchers, a vast, vast ecosystem at their beck and call. There's an underground marketplace, and there's always someone to replace, even though if we take down there's someone, a new group that will pop up, or they'll just take down their infrastructure and rebrand and come up 2 weeks later. The North Korean IT workers that we're seeing embedded in Fortune 500 companies around the world, they're not going to probably go to jail anytime soon. Pretty untouchable. Same with Russian threat actors operating out of Moscow. It's going to be hard to actually hold them to account. We're going to have to work harder to impact these actors, aren't we? The adversary is also evolving. I remember when the story was told to me in my time at Mandiant about the investigating APT1, or even just with in the FireEye days when we would get some type of spear phishing email from a Chinese threat actor. It was so obvious, no one would click on it, right? Well, things are different now. When we go to try and detect Chinese cyber threat actors, we're talking about no signature malware because they're doing living off the land techniques. They have orb networks that they're operating in, or shifting infrastructure that refreshes every 30 days, rented infrastructure. So this isn't as easy, let's say, as it used to be to detect these threat actors, and they're definitely evolving. So we can even think of, how security, I think there's a metaphor I hear sometimes that's really erroneous, and it's this comparison to safety. Have you heard that one? That security is almost like safety. When we think about like weather and risks assessments, and the problem with this mentality is that, you can probably assess the safety of, let's say, a hurricane or a storm that's coming, but we're still have to abide by the laws of physics, right? When we're dealing with the weather. A hurricane, for example, doesn't go home and retool itself to figure out how they're going to get you better the next time, right? And that's basically what we're dealing with security. And the adversary is definitely adapting. They're looking at new things. So when we went to cloud, they came with us. When we turned to SaaS, they came with us then. When we think about cryptocurrency or cultural changes of things like remote work, they followed us right to it. They are adapting just as fast as we are. The new type of APT, the advanced persistent teenager, is also a problem, right? So they're getting bolder and more reckless. When we do about 1,300 incidents a year through the Mandiant Consulting Group, and we have seen some horrible things. We have seen the North Korean threat actors target the NICU at a hospital. We've seen things like threats to our people, doxing of individuals. There's continues to be this threat landscape that is getting exponentially worse and not better. And when they threaten us, and when they dox us, and when they steal our IP and our businesses, when they target our hospitals, what are we doing in response? As an industry so far, I can tell you that we have this go-to, and it's called information sharing. Well, I can tell you that it's not working. Intel sharing is definitely not working. And unfortunately, it has been the go-to. It has been the goal. But if you share intelligence in the intelligence career field, there's one reason why you provide intelligence, and that is so that decision makers can take an action, whether it's on the battlefield, whether it's in an ecosystem, maybe it's a business leader they get intelligence in order to make decisions. We do this in order to make something happen. That's why we share intelligence, and that something needs to be disruption. Disruption has to be the goal. So blocking is just the beginning, but we have to move towards the source, up the value chain to actually break the adversary's processes. So what does this look like? A few years ago, I think everybody remembers SolarWinds. Mandiant had a special role in SolarWinds because we chose to expose it. Even I can tell you, behind the scenes, it was a very harrowing incident for us. It's the kind of thing where a lot of analysts go and polish their resumes. That's the kind of incident it was inside Mandiant. I know that Stacy was there as well. So while, if just as a quick refresher, the Russian SVR had infiltrated Mandiant using Golden SAML, which is basically this, a technique that allows an adversary to forge authentication tokens. They get federated access to different cloud apps and services. So the Russian SVR probably was counting on Mandiant to be quiet about it, right? And I can tell you that our CEO was actually given the advice that they legally didn't have to probably say a word because it hadn't met the threshold for customer info to being taken. It hadn't met that threshold for reporting at the time. But that is the opposite of what happened. We were not quiet. We went out and not only exposed, but we told everybody everything that we knew. And one really courageous decision by our CEO and the executive team that totally supported it was that the Russians had our red teaming tools. And in order to not give any leverage, we decided to burn all the tools and build new ones. So we had to get out there early before we really knew what was going on, before we even knew who it was. We exposed them, and it turns out they were not only just in Mandiant, they were all over the industry. They were in government agencies. This was one of the biggest infiltrations that had gone unnoticed in a very long time. And because of that exposure and that action of burning the tools and making sure there was no leverage, the results were much better than they would have been. It is my opinion that the Russians would still have access today if we hadn't done that. So what does it look like? Well, diplomats were dismissed. We had new energy backing legislation for mandatory reporting. And it was probably one of the finest hours that Mandiant ever had, turning an incident like that into something that we could actually be proud of how we handled it. Another way that, let's say, that exposure can be disruptive is with our commercial surveillance vendors that we've been tracking. So if you haven't been tracking this, so there are actually commercial companies that will, in many cases, illegally go and spy either to endpoints like phones or do some type of collection, and they do this for private contracted operations. So in 2022, Google put out a threat report exposing in particular a Spain-based CSV, commercial surveillance vendor, and because of this, a couple years later, they're out of business. And when TechCrunch reported that a former employee had said that Google's report might have been the beginning of the end for that company. This is just another example of how the power to expose can be very disruptive, but we have to take even more. So it's been like 5 minutes since I've said AI, so I feel like somebody's got to say it. So what AI is doing in this regard is giving us also a lot of opportunities. If you haven't read our blog on Big Sleep, we have 2 out now. Please do it. I think this is going to change things. So we are using an LLM to basically scan environments to find vulnerabilities. We were successful last November in finding one internally. Then we found out that we could actually look for one knowing that a threat actor was staging a 0-day. We were able to use Big Sleep. I know we have to change the name. It's not an exciting name. It's like someone's going to take a nap. But we were able to use it to then go and find a SQLite vulnerability before the threat actor could actually do it, to implement it. That's getting ahead. If you think about what an intelligence operation wants to do, this is it. It's proactively disrupting an event before it happens. And so after this, we have another blog that came out where we found 20 other ones. Rob Joyce said that we might have a cleansing forest fire if LLMs are going to be able to proactively scan vulnerabilities in environments. I don't know if that's going to happen, but what we know is that for defenders in particular, AI is proving to be a wonderful tool in many ways. And this type of disruption, this type of mentality shift is something that we really, really need to have happen. So all of these stories have one thing in common. And, the major plays are executed through partnerships, whether it's partnerships with our peers, vendors, even the press. We really have to understand that it's these partnerships that are going to make this happen. We have to be able to partner easily with international and domestic law enforcement, even small technology vendors that sometimes get overlooked, often will have a piece of the puzzle that we need in order to take an action. Organizations that have unique ties to targeted victims that can also have major impacts. And these are the type of partnerships that we at Google are looking for in order to do this type of work. So when it comes to disruption, I would say we shouldn't really get prescriptive about how we do it. The beauty of actually being this far behind is recognizing that our current methods aren't working. And there is no industry with more creative people who have more expertise than the cybersecurity industry. So I know you'll probably say, so Sandra, what are you guys going to do about it? Google is starting a disruption unit. We already have. I can't wait to tell you more about it as the months go on, but we're currently pursuing intelligence-led disruption, where we're going past, of course, we're always going to be policing our platform. And of course, we're taking steps for, our trust and safety organization is very, very good. But what we're doing in the Google Threat Intelligence Group is intelligence-led proactive identification of opportunities where we can actually take down some type of campaign or operation. We have to get from a reactive position to a proactive one. This type of intelligence sharing mentality to a proactive intel-led disruption mindset if we're going to make a difference right now. So Google's looking for partners. We want to identify opportunities where we can do legal and ethical disruption opportunities. This is something that's really important, and we have to evolve. We have to change. Sharing intelligence needs to be your step one, but not the goal. The goal has to be to do something, and that's what we're trying to do. So I'm happy to take any questions at this point. I know we only have a few minutes, but thank you so much. I said it all. No questions.
Thanks. Very interesting talk, Sandra. Thank you. Chris Roberti, U.S. Chamber of Commerce. On the disruption unit, is that publicly announced? Is that going to be publicly announced, or how are you? What's that? Well, I know you just did it now, Mark. But I mean, so how do you kind of keep this under the radar? You want to kind of move forward with it open?
Well, so obviously it's out, right? As I just said it, but we're looking for partners now. We have some current things that we can't discuss because they're ongoing, but I look forward to saying more in a few months about some of the specifics. But what we're really looking for is opportunities. So we would love to hear from you. All right. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Sandra. And I think what we're continuing to hear today is, we're here to talk about offensive cyber operations or active cyber defense measures, but I do see us zooming out and having this broader conversation about an overall strategy, and disruption seems to be a part of that. Again, offensive cyber operations being one tool amongst many in a toolbox. So thank you so much for Sandra. If the next panel wouldn't mind joining me on stage. Our next set of panelists are industry representatives who will focus on how companies can defend themselves during an ongoing attack, what measures are practical, what's legal, and how organizations balance the need for speed with the risk of escalation. Our moderator is my colleague, Davis here. He's the Senior Director in Cybersecurity Services at Venable. He's a nationally recognized cybersecurity thought leader whose work bridges government, the private sector, and academia. Prior to joining us here at Venable, he co-founded a cyber insurance startup that achieved record-breaking growth across the US, Canada, and Europe by innovating in cyber resilience and risk quantification. He has also managed cybersecurity product strategy for a major international firm and served in senior roles at both the National Security Council, leading cyber incident responses for federal systems, and the Department of Homeland Security, where he helped author early US cybersecurity legislation and shape interagency coordination. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us. David, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Stacy. And thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Flattery will get you everywhere with me, so I appreciate it. But I will say that our panel today is much more accomplished than my long form bio. What we wanted to do when we were talking about how to form this conference is that, I think in DC, we've heard a lot from the policy community or those working in the government about what we could or could not do. But what we wanted to do was get together a panel of folks outside the government in the private sector, but who have also had technical operator viewpoints, who know what we could do, but can maybe help us think through what should we do or what would we do. So today we have with us an excellent panel full of all folks who have served their country, oftentimes in uniform, but they're all through technical roles on one side of the cyber wall, and are now all defenders back on the other side. So first up, I'm going to introduce my co-founder. Stacy said, co-founder, we started the company Resilience together, cyber insurance and security company. V8, Vishal Hariprasad, goes by V8. He's not only the co-founder of Resilience, but also a military officer in the Air Force who's been involved in cyber operations his whole career, except for when he was fixing engines or stealing engine parts back in Korea. We have Andrew McClure, who is one of the managing partners of ForgePoint Capital, a cybersecurity specific venture capital firm. Andrew is also Marine, right? Marine officer. And then we've got Brandon Wales. Brandon was the executive director for CISA, and now is one of the VPs for government affairs at SentinelOne. And then we have finally Joe McAfee. And Joe was also a Marine, a technical cybersecurity warfare operator and defender, and is now the chief information security officer for fast-growing defense startup. Some of you may have heard of it, Anduril. So all of these gentlemen are protecting daily from the types of threats and actors that we are all talking about trying to change their mindset and goals today. And so first off, along that line, I was wondering, and maybe as the two guys that are currently fighting folks, V8 and Joe, maybe you could start off, but would you mind kind of giving us a lay of the land from where you see the adversary today, their aggressiveness, how how well some of our efforts for defense against them, both from like nation state actors that are coming for all of Anduril's incredibly cool autonomous systems, and V8 from a lot of the medium and large enterprises that you guys insure and secure.
Yeah. No, first of all, thanks for having me. Obviously, and I'm sure it's been talked about, it clearly has, that the threat landscape is just absolutely exploding. Like we're obviously worried about APTs, but we also see on a regular basis, like near daily basis, activity from ransomware gangs, cyber syndicates, scammers, spammers, security researchers who have very unclear intentions. So like really across the threat landscape, you see all sorts of actors cropping up, and there's been a noticeable increase in the last couple of years. And obviously, like AI and LLMs have a part to play with that. But I think more to the point is, what surprised me is the less sophisticated actors being able to have parity with some of the more sophisticated actors in terms of capability, particularly in terms of building out infrastructure, which makes it very difficult to find these people. So this is like the sort of activity that we've talked about before, where the ability to maintain and manage ephemeral infrastructure that you can launch attacks from. That used to be something that was really relegated to the APT space, and APTs were really good at doing this. But as of late, we've seen this across a bunch of actors, like cyber criminals, really scammers as well, that are able to spin up and down infrastructure from a whole bunch of different locations very, very quickly. And this makes it very challenging, not only to attribute like who is this activity actually coming from, but then like how do you actually stop it? Because it becomes a game of whack-a-mole. And so like, who are they? It's probably everybody. We worry about all of them. I'm particularly worried about the APTs because they're kind of low and slow about how they approach things, and that makes them very difficult to spot. What you do about it is obviously the hard part. But I think we're in like the Wild West right now, and just like just like the Wild West, where you had vast territory, and the ratio of law enforcement or people that could do anything about criminals in that vast territory was very small. You had very few, U.S. Marshals who were responsible for entire 1,000 square mile territory. We're in like the same boat now today, where we are. There's obviously great activity coming from our government, the intelligence community, who are doing great things. There's just not enough of them, and so how do we close that gap, I think, is the real question we have to answer.
And I'll double click on Joe's point. Ransomware is still one of the top causes of loss. So from an insurance perspective, cyber insurance, we talked about changing the economy for the bad actors. This is at least what I used to talk about when I was at Fort Meade. And the interesting part here is we insure thousands of companies in the global mid-market billion-dollar enterprises. We get to see their pain. These are companies that aren't going to do any offensive cyber operations themselves, but are the victim of these crimes. From a threat landscape, the number one by far leading cause of loss is ransomware. However, we are seeing a shift in the tactics. And I do think, point for this group here, insurance as a collective industry, great place to see, are we making behavioral change by our collective actions? I would say 80% of our ransomware claims today are not being paid, or by the client chooses not to pay them because they're better prepared, because they have defense in depth backups or other mechanisms, which is great. 4 years ago, that number would not have been above 50%. Huge kudos to all of us for driving the collective defense forward. However, for the folks that are in that 20% that are paying the claims, the severity is going up. And what we see is a change in tactics. It's no longer just encrypting your files and get the decrypt. It's the double extortion, where they're looking to lock you out, but then also release it on a time bound, right? So we're seeing their techniques change, or the TTPs of the threat actors. And I just think, for this group, insurance partnership is a great way to see that collective behavior. Point two is the change from 24 to 25. We see a 50% reduction in third-party and vendor risk losses. Last year, we all heard about Change Healthcare, CDK, some of these major systemic risks. We're seeing, for whatever reason, whether it's transitory, it's just over the first few months of this year, it's 50% down from last year. Now, I share that just because the insurance industry uniquely has a view of systemic risks, meaning dependencies that pop up around our portfolio. Again, we insure thousands of companies across North America and Europe. We end up seeing commonalities of claims before they're ever announced. These are incidents where the first person usually clients call just because law enforcement usually isn't there for them when they need. We end up seeing these patterns and are able to hopefully get proactive, to Sandra's point, where it makes sense. Third point on the threat landscape is 88% of all claims for 2025 have been successfully infiltrated because of the improvements in LLM technologies by attackers. 88% of all of our claims are through the social engineering vector, and we're just seeing, likely because of the efficacy and just frequency, and accuracy of these attacks.
Brandon or Andrew, do you guys have anything to add? I know, Brandon, you guys see a massive amount of threat landscape from your endpoint visibility.
Yeah, so I think we've heard all day in terms of the nature of the threat, but maybe I'll just take a step back and say, why are we seeing tremendous investments in the private sector from a defensive perspective, particularly in integrating things like artificial intelligence, which SentinelOne does, so do a lot of our competitors, but we're not seeing the same degree of investment in capabilities that will support improved offensive activities across the from the United States. And in part, we have created incentives in the defensive sphere for businesses that are moving them in the right direction. And I'm taking some of this from my colleague, Dakota Carey, who's done a lot of work looking at comparison US to China. But in the US, we operate offensive cyber like a centrally planned economy. In China, they operate it in an incentivized private sector market. There is tremendous capability in China in the private sector that the government is tapping into, that they are using to exploit our weaknesses here. And I think the broader problem that we're discussing today, and again, I think it tends to get focused around very specific ideas like hacking back or letters of marque. But the broader issue is, how do we create incentives for industry to help the United States and our allies more effectively conduct operations to disrupt malicious cyber actors? And I think that's going to require a whole lot of changes. Could be making things easier, like disruption operations that Sandra just talked about, or Kristen referenced earlier in terms of some of the Microsoft. It can't just be the two biggest companies in the market are the only ones with the capability to do this. We need to create more incentives for this to happen. More companies that have the potential for creating ideas that can easily feed into the government's ability to conduct operations. It can't just be a very small number of highly cleared contractors that in many cases won't even know what they should be building towards until they see some classified contract come out. So that is where I think we need to look as a community to say, how can we change this incentive structure? Because if we don't, we are still going to have this conversation in a year from now, and it's not going to change much.
Yeah. So thanks for teeing me up, Brandon. It's almost like you saw the questions. So what would we want though? I mean, as from the private sector's point of view, let's take away, the terms that the policy folks like us have come up with about hack back, active defense, range things. What are some active goals that private sector companies would want to happen that are not happening today? And, I think we had an earlier conversation about metrics, measuring. Like, how would we even measure those goals that go maybe beyond simply defense or activities on our own networks? And maybe Joe, you're leading defense today, as a CISO. What would you like to do that you can't do?
Yeah, I think just like the so what is the question, and there's a couple things here, but one of which is we need to raise the cost for an attacker to launch an attack. It needs to be expensive for them to launch an attack, not only expensive from a cost perspective, but also from a resource perspective. And that's just not the case today. Like right now, you can, and they do launch with effective impunity attacks all day, every day. There's very little risk to them of getting caught and anything happening if they do. So like the question we have to answer is, how do we raise that cost? How do we make it more expensive for them to actually conduct operations? And that's a hard challenge. And then like when we talk about hacking back, it's like, okay, well, what can we accomplish via hacking back? And I look at it's maybe a cheesy example, but if you ever seen the YouTube videos of where there's hackers who will hack back these scammers. I don't know if you guys have seen this. And so the scammer will call them. They'll like launch some remote session on their machine, and they'll hijack the hackers that are hacking back will hijack that remote session and get onto the machine of the scammers. And then they'll usually, this is kind of the question, is like, okay, now what? And what they do is they're trying to get clicks, they're trying to get YouTube views. And so they'll take over their camera system. They'll figure out who the person's real names are, and they'll basically mess with the scammers. Eventually they'll probably try to shut down the operation. But I think this is really where it becomes really challenging, is these hackers get very little traction from local law enforcement in these countries. And if they can shut down the operation, it's for a very limited period of time, maybe a couple of days, and those scammers are right back online doing the thing they did. So you get some views on YouTube, and you've kind of interrupted their operations, but you haven't fundamentally changed anything. It's really, you've just you haven't actually impacted much. And so I think even if we could do this as a private company, like even if we could hack back and land on the attacker's infrastructure, what are we going to do, knowing that infrastructure is very ephemeral, that they can just tear it down, spin it back up from somewhere else, and be right back to it? I think there's a real question of what you would actually do with that access, what you would really do with that in the hacking back. And I think the obvious answer is you probably want to land there and then use that access for intelligence gathering, so you can watch them. You wouldn't actually probably do much with it. And I think if you understand that and can appreciate that, then the implications of doing that on the wrong target set are probably a little bit less and a little bit more tolerable.
Yeah, that's, I think, the most successful one of those online things is probably when Mark Rober and the glitter bomb, in terms of both pissing off the adversary and getting YouTube clicks. But you're right. Like, what do you do after the glitter bomb? You really need the existing structures of state and diplomatic outreach and coordination with some type of government entity to actually shut those guys down and not let them come back. Andrew, I'm interested because you're an investor in the space in cybersecurity, and you have, a unique technical background. So you're seeing, the future market need here as you're looking at companies that may eventually be interested in this space. Do you mind talking a little bit about, and you don't have to give away your firm's investment thesis, but where do you see the market going over the next 10 years in this space? And what is that demand from people like Joe that might be there if there were some policy amendments to enable some of these actions?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing some of the frameworks being set right now. And I worry, though, that we're stuck in the past from a policy perspective on just not catching up with where industry is already moving. So I'll describe that here. So even just walking down the street to this venue and then sitting up here at a high level, you can look around the buildings at the top here and see an IAD system over there. And it's not because that Starbucks is particularly strategic. It's because there's a recognition that there's an area target here in this region that's of strategic value. The problem in cyber is that industry has been crying for help for a long time, and the response from their government has been, well, economic security is not really national security. And that was the case up until about 3 or 4 years ago, when Ann Neuberger said, you know what, this ransomware thing is really vexing us. We need to open up a realm of capabilities that we can actually tap into now. And you started seeing a bit more aggressive actions. Infrastructure takedowns, malware requisitioning. One of our portfolio companies was deputized by the FBI to pull out a lot of the staging malware during the Kaseya and SolarWinds episodes. So there are creative capabilities that are extant that we're already seeing, that many cyber lawyers are already being a part of. But what I worry is that we're stuck from a policy perspective in the past by focusing on things like cost imposition from a national perspective, when we're really fighting this battle, the U.S. government at times, with one hand tied behind our back without really going on the offense, right? And if that's the inherently governmental function of offensive cyber operations, we haven't even showed up. We're not even on the team. We're not even on the field yet today. So there's been this cry for help among industry to say, you know what, just like you don't expect that Starbucks to defend the national capital, you expect a bit of government support in many ways to provide a layer of defense. Having that in the realm of cyber would also be worthwhile. But you know what? Walking down the street, if I were also to be mugged, or maybe a lady here has a purse stolen, it is legally permissible in hot pursuit to go chase down your purse or your stolen goods. And so in many ways, there already is a legal capability for companies to go out and pull back what's been taken. We see that in the cyber realm, in a lot of the Bitcoin requisitioning as well, after ransomware episodes. So that's not unique. But Davis, I think what you're asking about, at least from where I sit as an investor, is that there's a market in an industry that doesn't yet exist. I think it's coming. If you look at the evolution of the policy perspective, here in the, if you read the National Cyber Strategy, and I know many in the room have contributed over the years to the different iterations, but back in 2011, the conversation was around defense and resilience. Back in 2014, there's a bit more interest in offensive actions, but it was still quite muted. Leading to 2018, now you had a bit more interest in cyber deterrence and what that meant. And of course, you saw that in the rewriting of PPD 20 to NSPM 13 and what that had meant. And I think the current team on the field is really interested in making progress on that and seeing how can they be creative with, and John mentioned cyber letters of marque. Took a little bit of interest in the last admin, and I think that'll be picked up again in this admin right now. What does that mean as far as creating the industries of the future that can also help support? And maybe it's not the existing companies today who want nothing to do with that, but it's a special entity purpose built to do something quite unique and novel. And I think there's a room for that in the future.
And then V8, I referenced that you were a victim, not because anyone's attacking resilience, but because, legally insurance has a role as a victim after you've paid a claim. So as, someone who's sitting on some of the financial impact of a lot of these events, what are some of your perspectives on what would you like to see change? What would be some goals for, your whole portfolio?
Yeah. And I guess the key term there is subrogation when it comes to insurance. For anybody who's been in an auto accident, to get your auto claim paid, you got to send all the pictures to the claim adjuster. Same thing with cyber insurance, right? The digital forensics, we have to get all that before we pay out a claim. But at the same time, we also take the subrogation rights. We pay out those tens of millions of dollars of ransomware, but we now have the right to go after or figure that out, right? We don't actually do that, but we have a definite interest in potentially reclaiming some of those funds. What's interesting though is, I think Michael Daniel talked about this earlier, the ability to get to operational collaboration versus threat sharing, which I couldn't agree with more. The issue in the private sector is government is a waste of time to deal with when it comes to cyber. You send data, it's a one-way street. You're lucky if you get anything back. Usually it's nothing. It's usually a waste of time, is the perception. It changed. I noticed a big change with a lot of my non-technical CISO clients and my insurance brokers when Colonial Pipeline happened. Again, not an OT attack. That was just a VPN access on the IT systems. But it hit a level of a red line for whatever reason that led to actions by the government that was actually acknowledged in the press. I had an inbound of companies wanting to share more data with the government, saying, hey, how do we get on that program? We see what they could do. All of a sudden I think their infrastructure disappeared overnight or got locked out. Why can't we do that for regular things? Was the question I was getting out of the woodworks. So I would love to I think point one to your question, see more clear definitions of red lines so that we can set expectations with the private sector on when the government will respond and what the level of information is required to play. I think we will get a lot more interaction and a lot more details from the private sector if there's a sense of action. The second thing I'd share, and this is something that I've been very excited about, is I think somebody said something about Cyber Command being a 15-year-old. Well, it actually works though in an interesting way. We have real-time sharing with Cyber Command, with CISA, and with FBI's TACU, also with the UK's NCSC and DCA. Some of our tippers and alerts led to the arrests of ransomware actors. Would love to see that scaled up, period. I mean, we're already doing disruption operations, takedown operations. Well, we aren't. We're providing the tippers, the queuing, and the aggregate threat intel to make that happen, to direct it. We'd just love to see that go at a even higher scale. It's already working. It's just not publicized, so nobody knows about it. And it's kind of just, best efforts at the moment. Would love to see further investment on those two areas.
Yeah, that's great. Bridging into sort of the final area is, what are some active either services, approaches, technologies that you guys have actively seen are the future to get some of these goals, to enable better cooperation, help with a focus on campaigns, potentially reach back in surveillance? Like, what have you guys seen out there today? And, Andrew, I don't know if you want to take this again, but being more specific, like, what's the world of solutions that exist today? And Sandra had a great announcement from Google. Phenomenal to see more large companies getting into the game, being actively focused on working to counter some of the air operations. What else are you guys seeing out there?
Better ransomware negotiation, to pick up on a point that V8 had mentioned. Look, I mean, we see payouts as low as 15% right now in the industry. That's a big thing. Large companies like Microsoft made a lot of headway in infrastructure takedowns. Of course, there's a lot of coordination involved in that. Some of that's very public. It accrues to their brand equity value also as being a helpful partner. But you also have, the crypto, pullbacks that I talked about in the last admin. I mean, all those are helpful, and they're creative ways to start getting back. But the problem is, there's not yet a defined set of framework or a policy proposal yet on what that actually entails. So what is considered, a privacy violation of pulling back malware that's already staged? I mean, what if you talk to telcos right now and they'll say, hey, look, we want to be neutral to all the traffic that goes along our pipes, but over at the border gateway, we can just sinkhole everything that we know is known malicious. Why are we not doing that today? Right? Is it really because we don't want to, for neutrality's sake, and it's an ideological constraint, or is it a lack of capability to understand what's actually transitioning the pipes right now? So there's a lot of other things that we can start doing that we're not. And it's all short of going and hacking back, but that's also at the other end of the spectrum, which I would suggest is something that, we need to apply serious pressure on, because, right now, I think there are already companies who have a capability with their own infrastructure, their own tools, who can go in, identify targets, maybe within a framework set by government overseers, and a defined set of boundaries on how they might go in and not only reposition lost data, but also bring back stolen assets in other areas. So there's a lot more that we could be done. We just don't have a policy framework, because most discussion, at least in the think tank community, is hack back is whack, and it's something in the past, and it's not moving the conversation forward. But again, if you look at the progress of where we've come from, it's actually the future of where we're going, to be more active in our defense, and frankly, to be more aggressive in our posture of hitting back at the adversary.
That's going to be a DEF CON policy sticker next year. Hack back ain't whack. So wait for it. Heather West is around here somewhere. Brandon, from being inside CISA at a time when I was there, and it wasn't even called CISA, but still trying to get its feet. It was a gangly teenager. So when you guys were there, really had an operational footing. What are you seeing now, or what are some ideas that you, or some successes in going beyond just purely defensive measures, that you think could be interesting for the private sector side and palatable from the government side?
Yeah. So, I mean, my sense is a lot of what we need to do, particularly the easier things, are really about speed and scale, because we have already dramatically improved as a country the flywheel between defensive operations feeding offensive operations at Cyber Command. The question is, that only happens in a limited number of circumstances. Only a small number of companies are able to provide information that's actually feeding that in a time where you can actually make an actual operational difference. If we want to get ahead of the challenges at the scale that we're operating, we have to be able to do that much faster and for far more incidents. I think secondly, we need to be looking for what are some of the barriers to success and speed for companies like Microsoft and Google to execute infrastructure disruptions and takedowns. It can't just be they have to do it going through a very laborious civil court procedure. If that is the case, we're only going to continue to be able to do a very, very small number of those. that is never going to keep up with the nature of the ransomware threat, let alone some of the nation states. I then think you need to think through, all right, those are places where we know how it works. It's really about optimizing performance to get you the speed and scale, the nature of the threat we're facing. But I think as you look further out, the question is, how do you get the private sector more involved in offensive operations? How do you get more innovation? I think you're seeing the Department of Defense do this in other areas, Andrew being an example, but many other companies getting involved in the defense tech space. But you don't necessarily have that degree of clarity around offensive cyber capabilities. What tools does DoD need to make next generation cyber threats a reality, offensive cyber operations a reality? What kind of exploits should they be looking for and developing? Because those are the ones that are most sought after. Only a very, very small number of companies can see that today, which means we're missing out on the scale of innovation that you would want to actually feed a more dynamic, more aggressive posture from the US government. And so I think those are all things we know how to do because we're trying to get them done in other contexts. We just haven't applied the thought leadership in cyber to figure out what are the policy blockers, what are the legal barriers, and how can we get Congress to make some very targeted changes so they can achieve this. And I think that would be a place where Congress can add more value than looking for some of these much harder to achieve, much more dubious questions, things like executing letters of marque are going to solve this problem. They're probably not. There are probably much easier solutions with much easier legislative challenges that we can do now that are actually going to make much more significant improvements in our security.
Yeah. And then Joe, I'll give you the last word because I know Palmer and Trey have taken a real startup mindset to the behemoth of DoD. Like, what are you guys seeing working that maybe you're doing differently than other members of the DIB that we should expand across the DIB?
Well, I mean, there's a few things, but I think in general, we look at the totality of the risk spectrum and we identify like where can you take acceptable risk, where can you not take risk, and then you apply your pressure into those places where you can take acceptable risks, and that allows us to move faster. We have to realize like you can't move fast and take no risk. It's just not an option. Like you have to figure out where the right places to take risk are. And I think everybody said it today here, where all of the things that we need to do in order to fight back in some way, shape, or form are already happening. They're just happening at too small of a scale to really make the impact that we need to see. And so like we just need to 100x all of those activities across the board. And I think if we do that, we will start to see some success.
Awesome. I think we're up for questions now. Yes.
So I like that sentiment that we need to 100x what we're doing now. So Meredith Burkhart, my last day at FBI was Friday. I'm now in industry. So big fan of CNO, a young member, my young self at 20 when I entered the FBI cyber division said, there's this thing called letters of marque and we should do it. And I was told, thanks, kid. That's not something we're interested in right now. But we're having this conversation still. I guess my question for this panel is, we talk about policy, we talk about law. I love cyber policy. The other part of this, though, is if we're going to 100x it, what about resources? Can we do this on policy, law, grit, and desire alone? Or is this going to require more resources? And where is that going to come from? And I would love to hear you guys' opinion on that from industry. I know what the opinion from government is you know, we need more funding, we need more resources, things like that. But I would actually love to hear your perspective. Over.
Yeah, just real quick. The only way to do it is, and this is like the same approach Andrew takes, which is you have to get the incentives aligned such that it makes sense for companies to put them to invest resources such that we can actually fight back. I think like as a small example, like the offensive security companies, they exist today. They have one customer primarily. It's governments, primarily in the US, it's the US government. And it's a really tough business to be in. And because of that, like if you develop an exploit, you can sell it to one person legally, one organization legally. And if that gets burned, you're back at, not very easily, actually, very, very challenging. And then you sell it and then it gets burned and you have to start back at square one. So like the incentive is really stay out of the business, don't get into it. We have to reverse that. And the only way to reverse that is to make the industry and the market more palatable for new incumbents or new entrants. And like the way to do that is is to allow private companies to pay for those sorts of services in some sort of regulated and managed way. That's just one example in like the offensive security space. And then you have to take that sort of thing and apply it across all these other areas and like policy and law and et cetera.
And I would add, today, good, effective offensive cyber operations are incredibly manpower intensive and time intensive for those operators conducting them. That is hard to scale. And so if we are going to scale, again, looking at areas where the private sector contribute, how do you apply cutting edge technology and innovation in this space to make that easier so that one operator can conduct 10 times the number of operations effectively with the same amount of stealth and effectiveness that they do today? I mean, I think these are what we're going to have to solve, because we're not going to be able to 100x the budget of every one of the cybersecurity agencies and Cyber Command and FBI to make that a reality. How do you get innovation? And I think that is where one of the areas where the private sector could be such a valuable force multiplier here in helping us get to more of that scale.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here because I think there was a consensus from the panels this morning that we're not winning this fight on demarches and indictments. That's not moving the needle. And I would go so far to say, cyber deterrence really is not quite a thing, right? Cost imposition is not happening. We haven't seen any real change in the cyber landscape. Now, there was one episode that was alluded to earlier, and that was she over at the Sunnyland Summit back a dozen years ago, where we saw a pause in Chinese activity for about 6 months, and then it picked up a pace further. But why did she stop? It's because he wanted something very specific from President Obama at the time. And so other than that, I can't really think of many examples where deterrents have worked. In fact, before cyber, before my military career, I was trained as a physicist. And in physics, we have this towering figure, Thomas Kuhn, who wrote this great book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And so it's this idea, if you've ever heard of the paradigm shift. Right now, we're in a paradigm lock in cyber deterrence, and it's preventing all the wrong things. It's preventing all the right things, I think, from happening or going into the NDAA. Policymakers, congresswomen, they're all talking about how to deter the adversary. I just look around and I don't see anybody really deterred. But the other constraint that I've heard from today is scale. Right? There's, of course, inherently governmental functions that we're all talking about, and there's limited time, attention, and resources. But what we've seen is that in industry, there's a reason you get to, say, reusable rockets when you think about market cost and inputs, and instead of billing on time and materials on fixed price. So I'm a believer that the market and the entrepreneurism where I sit, where I see every day that, I may do 10 things and 7 or 8 of them, frankly, will fail. But it's that 1 or 2 things that are going to really take off that's going to make me incredibly successful. I just don't see that experimentation right now out of the government sector. And I would like to see it. So we can brush off letter of marks. We can brush off offensive cyber. We can brush off industry taking a more aggressive approach. I just would hesitate about killing the baby or throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, because what we're doing is we actually don't know what's going to work. And I think having the intellectual honesty on figuring out, hey, maybe this is actually a good thing. Maybe we start small with the right boundaries. This is a force multiplier where now our inherently scarce resources of government time, attention, personnel, and policy can focus on setting the boundaries, the conditions, and making this feasible will then scale over time. And we've seen this in the defense innovation area. We've seen this in a number of other market areas where V8 and I and Joe also sit.
And I'll say just one of the key constraints, and to touch on what Brandon said too, cyber operators, it's very manpower intensive. But I think in this recent era of AI and LLMs, as a cyber capability developer myself, it's much faster and easier to write exploits. The tools, the systems are just getting there on both sides, good and bad sides. The key thing when it comes to operations is just this worry about equity and keeping things stealth. There's a level of tools that we don't care if they get burned. And frankly, we should just be much more comfortable about using those burnable assets if it has the desired effects that we're discussing here today. And so the one thing I say is just that limiting factor, that veneer or limiting factor of not burning our assets. There's assets that are burnable. We just need to make a choice.
Yeah, someone mentioned earlier today the analysis of targeted takedowns and arrests versus mowing the lawn. Maybe that's our next economic paper is what's the cost of mowing the lawn continuously versus never being able to arrest these guys. Although when I was in the White House, we did get one guy to travel to visit, I think his like fiance, and then, you know, pop them. But I mean, like you only get a few chances that people going to go visit their boat in Monaco before they stop buying and keeping their boats in Monaco. One more question? All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate all you guys giving a very candid view from inside on the private sector side. Thank you very much for coming all the way from California too.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much for that. I feel like we could have kept them up here for quite a long time. I think it's kind of exciting to start fleshing out some of the capabilities that we've already got in the private sector. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. There's some snacks and coffee outside, and then we'll rejoin here at 2:50. We've got one more set of keynote remarks, one final panel, and then please, if you can, stick around. We do have a reception starting right around 4 o'clock. Thank you. All right, could I have everybody take their seats, please? All right, I'm honored to introduce our final keynote speaker for the day, Mr. Chris Painter. He is the founding partner at the Cyber Policy Group. Chris previously served as the State Department's top cyber diplomat and has been a central figure in shaping international norms for cyberspace. He's a globally recognized pioneer in cyber policy and diplomacy. Chris began his career as a federal prosecutor handling landmark cybercrime cases, including the prosecutions of Kevin Mitnick and early internet-enabled stock manipulation, before rising to serve in senior positions across the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the White House National Security Council. As the first ever U.S. cyber diplomat at the State Department, he established the Office of the Coordinator for Cyber Issues and led international efforts to secure a more open, interoperable, and stable cyberspace. By the way, speaking of Mitnick, if you haven't read it, his book, Ghost in the Wires, is one of my favorites. I highly recommend it. I don't know if you've read it, but it's wonderful. So thank you, Chris, for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, and it's great to be here. You know, as often happens when you're one of the last speakers, almost everyone has said things I was going to say, although I haven't said them yet. So I will say them. And I will say this. First, I feel I have to defend, you know, as I mentioned, I was a former prosecutor, so I'm a recovering lawyer. And I always say, you know, especially when you're in late afternoon, you like to tell a lawyer joke to break the ice. But the problem with lawyer jokes is that non-lawyers, lawyers don't think they're funny and non-lawyers don't think they're jokes. So that's an old joke, but that goes in theme with this conversation, which we seem to be having forever. And I would say on the point that was made earlier about lawyers, it's often not the lawyers who say no. In my experience, working in policy things, it's the policymakers who are wringing their hands and can't decide and won't take risks. Lawyers tell you what the risks are. Lawyers tell you what the bounds are. But you absolutely should engage with them. You should actually find out what's going on. You should do it early on. And often they're blamed for these decisions when it really wasn't them. It was the policymakers not wanting to do things. So on that, I think the theme of this talk that introduced this panel is Michael called me out for talking about various movie things. I think the theme with this would be Groundhog Day, you know, so that we wake up every morning, we're having the same conversation again and again. It's like a bad dream. The only difference is in Groundhog Day, he improved every day, where we don't. We don't make any progress at all. And I don't think this will surprise people, but I totally agree. I don't actually think it was controversial what Dimitri said this morning. I totally agree with it. I think, you know, I remember hearing about hackbacks as early as 2005 when I was a prosecutor. After I left the government, I wrote an article about why we need to be much stronger in imposing consequences and deterrence. These are not new conversations, and I don't think it's controversial to say we need to do this more, but we still haven't done it. And you know, when we talk especially about red lines, well, I said, I think governments, the U.S. government in particular, but other governments need to be much stronger using cyber as one of the tools in its arsenal, building up its capabilities and using it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But one of the problems, and this just shows the failure of this, is one of the titles of the panel coming up is red lines. We're terrible with red lines. So we don't set any red lines. We let people walk all over the red lines. We do nothing about it or nothing really visible about it or are constant about it or predictable about it are really harmful to the adversary about it. You know, a good example was back when the NotPetya happened at the Munich Security Conference. Rob Joyce then made the announcement with a number of other allies that we attributed it to Russia 9 months after the fact and said, and there will be consequences. That really scares me if I'm an adversary, that there'll be some undetermined consequences sometime in the future rather than something that's surer and quicker and actually more harmful in the short term. And I think we need to be much better at that. So we need to be able to impose consequences that are actually going to harm them. And there was a Defense Science Board report that Chris Inglis and others were involved in years ago saying tailored deterrence for the adversary, what actually they care about, not just in cyber, but across the board. They have to be meaningful consequences. They have to be timely, which we're not good at. And we, I think, have to do something. I forget, maybe it was Michael that said this earlier. We have to not be so coy about us doing it. We have to talk about our capabilities. We have to actually say when things are happening sometimes. Now, you don't want to release your TTPs. You don't want to give away your trade secrets. But if you're actually doing something and you're burning a vulnerability that you're using, you should, you know, why not say to the adversary, look, we're doing this to you. We're going to keep doing this to you until you change your behavior or do something different. And also advertise that with our allies and partners, really make much more of a case for this. And we don't do this partly for the reasons Michael said, that this is grounded in secrecy. It's the idea that we don't want to be seen. To be sure, if we're doing an espionage operation, we don't want to be seen. If we're doing this kind of operation, you want to be seen. You want them to understand what's going on. At the same time, I think, as everyone said today too, there is no silver bullet here. Cyber operations alone by the government or anyone else, and bottom line up front, I believe the government needs to do this much more effectively and with partners and others. I don't think the private sector is well suited to that, and I will mirror what many others have said, but it's still not a silver bullet. You have to make it part of a larger strategy using all the tools we have, including what we have been resistant to doing. I remember when I was in the government having this argument about why aren't we going after other things that, say, China or Russia care about? Why are we limiting ourselves to these bans? And the answer I got then was, well, we don't want to do what China does. We don't want to go out of band. We don't want to do things. So, for instance, when you talk about the Dalai Lama, they will cancel a visit to their country. Why not? They're doing it already. Why wouldn't you use all the tools we have across the board to actually try to shape behavior? And I think we need to change that view. So I think the other thing, and this is alluded to earlier, is we need to make sure we know what we're talking about. Are we trying to deter or use cyber operations to deter espionage? No. I mean, and the problem is policymakers, and you all know this, except for if you're doing it, tend to ball all these things up at once. You talk about Salt Typhoon and Bull Typhoon in the same breath. You talk about intrusions that are meant to steal information. At the same time, you're talking about disruptive operations. That doesn't make any sense. We need to be much better at parsing these out and saying, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we're trying to change, and how we do that. So that, I think, is part of it. I think the other part of it is that we also need to look at what the consequences are. So even though I am in favor of us taking a more muscular view on this and other areas to deter or actually to combat, especially nation state behavior, and I think ransomware is a little different, but there's often a nation state involved there too. There are some dangers, and there's some dangers, particularly in the international space. For instance, if you're hitting, hunt forward stuff that Cyber Command and others done, I think that's really good. It's cooperative. That makes sense. If you're going after adversary infrastructure in a third-party country, say France or Germany, maybe you want to work with them. Maybe it's better to try to find a way to have a collaborative, collective approach rather than doing things unilaterally. Now, sometimes you might have to do things unilaterally, and I understand that. The flaming ball of cyber death is coming toward you, and you have to do something. Great. But at the same time, there's often a chance to be more collaborative. In the long term, I think it really builds that up, and we need to do that. But we need to actually have a much clearer declaratory policy, and much clearer, and this is all stuff that we've been saying for years, much clearer idea of when we're going to go against them, with a blurry of the red line, of course, for strategic reasons, but working with partners and allies to do this, and not trying to just focus on short-term individual efforts, but more of a collective effort. It goes to another movie, I would say, the stop trying to hit me and just hit me, because we just stay on the outside and we maybe threaten things, but don't really threaten them credibly. I totally agree with what Dimitri said this morning, that as long as we don't react strongly to these things, we're creating a norm that it's okay. we are being escalatory by not acting, by not doing something, but by both us and our allies. So I'm in favor, I think, of stronger campaigns, international campaigns, particularly working with allies and partners. I think we can build a common view of this. Certainly, they have been victimized. They have capabilities too. Many more countries, as you know, are developing their own capabilities. Even Japan is looking at this and others. So we don't want a free for all where everyone's using these capabilities and it's just crossing over the web and everyone's getting hit. We want to coordinate in a much better way. And that means also sharing information. Now, as I said, so there are some issues in even the government doing this, but we need to there's ways for us to coordinate. There's ways for us to step this up. There's ways for us to scale that we're not doing that. So when you go to the private sector, though, and talk about the classical idea of hacking back, I think, there's a lot of challenges and there's international challenges, but first and foremost, I think one of the challenges is that a lot of the targets we see hit in the private sector and in the government too are simply not secure. We haven't done the homework of actually the resiliency of the protection that we need of hardening the targets. We've talked about that for 25 years too, but we're still not there. So the analogy in sort of the pirate and letters of market area is you're in a sinking boat, you're firing your cannon hoping to hit the other side, not too effective, right? Your boat still sinks. And maybe you have some short-term effect on the other boat, but there are a lot of other boats out there. So maybe what you should do is patch the holes in your boat first. So that's part of it. The other thing is, to go to Jaws, we need a bigger boat too. So we need a way to deal with this in a more scalable way. And the private sector doing it alone, or even working with the government under some of the things proposed, there's still a good chance of hitting an unintended or innocent target, especially nation state adversaries, as others have said, are very sophisticated. They're going to use proxies and others to go at you. If you're the private sector, you hit those innocent boxes, or you hit a box, whether it's innocent or not, in a third-party country like France or Germany. There's lots of exposures there. I don't think there's any scheme, letters of marque or otherwise, that really protects you for that. I don't think there's any scheme that, frankly, will allow the private sector to act in a way that they have protection. And I don't really believe the U.S. government's going to be able to monitor other private sector action under some of these areas or certify people, because, frankly, the U.S. government has problems monitoring itself most of the time. So trying to do that with the entire private sector or any subset of that, I think, is difficult. There's also the issues of, what is a proper target? What is a violation of international law or norms? If you're going to go after the infrastructure, the public infrastructure, I remember having a conversation when I was in government in response to one of the hacks saying, let's just turn off the lights in Moscow. No, that's not, unless we're at wartime, and even then they have to be a valid military target and there's distinction and proportionality. No, we don't do that. So how do you do that? And if the private sector is doing that, are they going to feel as constrained to obey international law, obey international norms? Will that be not just, problematic for the adversary, but also for our allies? So I think that's a problem too. And the other is deconfliction. It's hard enough for the U.S. government to do deconfliction, law enforcement deconfliction, intelligence deconfliction, military deconfliction within our own government. Then to do it with allies and partners, that makes it even more difficult. Now, the private sector trying to do that is just near impossible. So I think you're not going to have that happen. But what you could have happen, and I think makes a lot of sense, is that you can have, as others suggested, a lot more public sector, private sector collaboration, even helping with like damage assessments, targeting. There's lots of stuff and disruption efforts for ransomware. There's a lot of things the private sector can do that I think need to be leveraged. And we always use the rubric public-private partnership as it's some mantra that's going to solve everything. It's not, but really practical things that you can do between each side. And I think one of the things I liked in the last panel talking about this is tipping and queuing. I mean, I think that's something where the actor is still going to be the government that takes the action, but they're getting the information and maybe the tipping and queuing from the private sector, or getting the tool development from the private sector. There's a lot of room to run there, but having them actually take the frontline view of attacking, I think, is really problematic. It's Michael and I are having a conversation just before the said, the private sector builds ships. They don't send those ships and they don't man those ships into war, for instance. So you want to have I think there's a huge role, but we're not really tapping. And so, I think as we look at this area and for this next panel, I think there's a lot of things we can talk about the international environment, both positive and negative. The negative is all the various challenges we face, legal and other challenges if we go down this road. The positive is we can work much more collaboratively with our international partners. We don't even have to do it as a nation state alone. Yes, we have great capabilities. I've heard people say, well, even if they go against us, even if there's blowback, even if other countries start doing this too, and because there's a lot of bad actors in our territory, coming from our territory, and so if they hit us, how would we feel? We're so advanced, we're okay. Not as much anymore. I think that's changing too. So you need this much more collaborative environment. You need to build capability. I'm sure you'll hear this from Mark in this coming panel of how you're going to build this capability. And there are various ways to do that. But what I don't want to have is the Groundhog Day end. I don't want to have, I used to say, if we're still having this conversations in 5 years, please kill me. I don't want to say that now. I'd like to live a little longer. I fear that we would still be having this conversation in 5 years unless we really have a major change in focus, and not just words of saying we're going to be more muscular, but looking at all the tools that we have, not just the cyber offensive tools, but putting it all together. So with that, I'll turn to the next panel, to Stacy. I think this should be a great conversation. Thanks.
All right, if I could get our final panelists to join me on the stage, please. Our final panel is going to look outward, exploring how the U.S. and its allies, come on up, guys, and how its allies should define red lines, promote norms of responsible behavior, and coordinate responses to malicious activity on the global stage. Moderating this panel is my colleague, Peter Brown, Senior Director for Global Security and Technology Strategy at Venable. Peter has extensive cross-border policy and technology expertise, helping organizations navigate global cybersecurity challenges. He has a rare blend of deep public service and strategic technology expertise to today's conversation. With over 25 years of leadership in shaping global tech policy, he previously served as senior advisor to the European Parliament on technology strategy and governance, where he guided the Parliament's first information and technology governance strategy and provided high-level policy advisement. He has also advised Fortune 50 companies, national governments, and international organizations on critical issues like cybersecurity, AI, cloud computing, and IoT. Peter, over to you. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stacey, for that comprehensive introduction. Makes me a bit nervous. This is my first time at Venable, so despite all those years of experience, there's always new opportunities for tripping up or screwing up. I'm pleased we have three great panelists with us here. From my left to the right, we have Catherine Condello, fellow at Lumen Technologies, fellow for National Security Emergency Preparedness. To her right, Matt Hayden, Vice President of General Dynamics Information Technology. And next to me, Mark Montgomery, both Senior Fellow and Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. During the course of the day, we've been through the issues of hackback or not, looking at the spectrum of tools available and how an industry might be able to respond even real time. And Chris, in his keynote just then, sort of started talking about red lines and what we should or shouldn't cross. And that's the title for this last panel, on red lines and potential rules for the road, both in the US and internationally. What we're going to try and do is a bit of scene setting around some of those key challenges, look at potential solutions, and if we have some time, maybe look at some of the congressional proposals on these issues. So let's get going. First sort of question, and maybe Matt and Mark could both address this, and that is, what do you see as the core challenge that we're facing today and that needs to be addressed?
Do you want me to go first? All right. So it's been said a number of times, ransomware really is the driver for a lot of our cybersecurity posture around the world. It's not just the United States. It's literally the innovation source for a lot of challenges. It's also an actual gift to us because we were so used to operating in a space where intelligence collection and friend and foe action on cybers were all we were seeing. So we really couldn't speak to it because it was always locked away in a SCIF. So now we have this very blatant set of criminals that we can take on as a collective and demonstrate how that's bad, no matter who's talking, no matter who's doing the thing. So we do have an ability to get behind some of these
large scale vulnerability disclosures, large scale problems as a community globally. But it wasn't until ransomware came around that we actually started to kind of compare notes and work in that way. We're still not at the place where countries compare tools or countries compare what they've got in their cyber arsenal to take on other activities as necessary. That's just not where we are as an intergovernmental world at the moment. But we are using the cybersecurity needs of combating ransomware to start having these conversations about targeting infrastructure, targeting bad guys doing bad things in bad places.
Mark.
Well, I agree with all that. I remind myself, I was in the same room maybe 8 or 9 months ago. Ari hosted a thing, the Health ISAC here, right? And health sectors that's one of our 8 or 9 critical infrastructures that are a dumpster fire, right? We have most of our critical infrastructure is unprotected to the level it needs to be. And the thing that exposes it to criminal activity, the thing that should worry us as national security professionals is that nation states can take advantage of those same vulnerabilities and hold us at risk. I have very little faith that we can generate force to get over to a contingency in Taiwan or to get to a contingency in Europe. Our longstanding plans of using the American rail system, the American aviation, the American port system, powered by the American, by the electrical power grid, and which necessarily needs our water system, which necessarily needs personnel who require our healthcare system, things like that. It's not going to work. I think most of us understand what Volt Typhoon represents. It represents an initial inkling that China gets it. And China is absolutely preparing our battle space for with either malware or accesses for future bad behavior to put our critical infrastructure at risk. Chris mentioned rightly that there was some period of time in the back. I think you got to go back 25 years in the Wayback Machine to get to the point where our critical infrastructure was reliable. Probably in the Cold War, where we were thinking about Soviet physical attacks on our system, we took it very seriously. There wasn't a cyber vulnerability then. That was the last time we were okay. As we took the busman's holiday of the fall of the Berlin Wall, cyber impact on critical infrastructure began to evidence itself. And those two things worked in context to the point where we're now 10 or 15 years behind in defending our critical infrastructures in cyberspace. So yeah, I'm worried. I agree with you. Ransomware is the thing that we see. The nation states is the thing we need to worry about.
Catherine, maybe I can bring you in here. I mean, to give maybe a bit of a perspective from outside of the US. I mean, what are other countries doing that we're not, and what should, do we need them to do more, and which should we be maybe copying or jumping on board some of the things they're doing?
It's not that I don't think other countries are doing things, they are. But I think they are definitely more focused on, I'm going to call it active cyber defense, or if you will, cyber defense as opposed to offense. And I think the two to mention of note, certainly the UK's NCS, the Active Cyber Defense Program, which started in 2017, and they're now moving to ACD 2.0. I think they announced this year. And then most recently, Japan taking we need to sort of be more active in our defense. And I think the UK was particularly articulate about it. It was sort of be able to protect the nation at large from commonplace things. In essence, let's take care of the obvious things, and then we can focus on, let's say, the nation state or the really bad guy sort of stuff. And I see inclinations, even though Japan is still very early stages. I think they just announced the law a couple of months ago, 4 months ago, something like that. They're still in early stages. They seem to be taking the same approach, where the intelligence that they can get on the incoming into the country, that they can monitor to see if there's bad things coming, so that they're in a position to take down if necessary. And clearly Japan, if there was bad infrastructure in my favorite country, Zimbabwe, they would have to work with Zimbabwe to be able to physically, take down the infrastructure. The point is, they're willing to now put themselves in a position to respond and to take direct action. Now, in all of these cases, in the UK, the US, Japan, they are relying significantly on the current infrastructure in the industry. And it's here where I think the US can do more. Japan is just kicking off, so I'm not going to fault them with them. And I think that the UK has been particularly useful. I don't want to give the impression that industry is not doing anything. I mean, Lumen alone, because we've got AS3356, so we're the most deeply peered. So we see a lot of stuff going on. We do 150 disruptions of bad activity per month. Now, do I go and take down servers? No. But if something is attacking Lumen or attacking some of our major customers, so there's already sort of no, we're not going there. Is this active cyber offense? No. Is it active defense? Yes. Is there a capability to be able to translate that defensive action through the tip and cue kind of discussion that we had earlier, so that then someone does something about it quicker? Yes. It's my observation from doing this for, as they say when you're older, a while, that you can tip and cue in January, and you can work with your government partners or whoever you're working with for quite some time. But at best, it's going to be the following January where you see the manifestation. And surely that can be shortened. So with respect to the cyber offensive things, I think that the path, and I think was outlined in the article that was published by this institution, the more public-private kind of stuff and making it better, making it faster, I think is the way to go.
Mark, you want to?
Yeah, I have almost no faith that our allies are in a position to do any better on offensive cyber than us. One of the problems we have over the last 30, 40 years is the United States, and you can see this in almost every weapon system. If we decide to not do something aggressively, if we catch a little bit of a cold and slow down, like our allies get pneumonia and are completely incapacitated. And so I don't think we're in a good shape. I've spent a lot of time with the Japanese. The idea that the Japanese would do a thing offensively is beyond, without the United States completely leading the way is unlikely. I like what you're saying about Lumen. I agree the companies are doing more in the United States, but I'm gonna tell you right now, I don't think the only partner of ours that's moved on without us is the one that felt it had threats that if they did not take proactive action, they'd be in trouble, and that's Israel. Israel's the country that's more aggressive. Now, what Israel does is, you mess with my infrastructure, I bomb you, which is what we say we do. We say we reserve the right to respond any way we can. Do we have a response to a physical response to a cyber incident? We've got sanctions and economic bullshit, but we have not physically attacked anybody for doing this to us. But if you go to DOD, that's their talking point. And it's been a 25-year talking point, and it's baloney, because if you don't do something every 25 years, it's actually a deterrent it encourages people to do shit to you.
So I'd like your take on this, and then on to Matt. So what could be some steps that we could take to move beyond that status quo?
Well, I'm not going to sit here and give a pitch. Stifel's supposed to be here. I'm his wingman for Cyberforce here, but and we're going to win, because we're eventually going to get in there with Trump, appeal to his ego with the, who's the only president to create two military forces, George Washington, the Army and the Navy, who can be the second, Donald Trump, the Space Force and Cyber Force, and might drop out of the room. But look, I won't argue the Cyber Force thing, but I will argue one of the side hustle benefits of the Cyber Force thing, which is that we need a stronger guard, reserve, and auxiliary. And the only way I think to get to that is to have a cyber force. Again, set that aside. What I mean by stronger guard, reserve, and auxiliary are guards, reserve, and auxiliary that can use non-Title 10, Title 50 authorities to be more aggressive in supporting. So I think there's a big opportunity here in exploiting those values. And last thing I say is, forget even DHS. It's under their governor's authorities. Most governors have the equivalent of martial law authority, and that's to handle hurricanes and earthquakes and stuff. And I'm not suggesting martial law for DC or any other state, but I do believe that that under those authorities we could have an aggressive program if we had enough on-net operator, offensive cyber operators, people skilled in have the right skill sets ready to go in the guard.
Okay. Matt.
So when you think about cyber operations, you usually think like, hey, I've got malware experts in Russia targeting my infrastructure. I want to target their infrastructure in Russia. Well, the sad fact is that a majority of that infrastructure is either in the United States or it's with friendlies. So when we start talking about cyber operations, we're actually talking about our neighbors. We're not talking about going outside of the dotted lines. The honeypotting we do shows that a majority of the attempts on networks by criminal and nation state adversaries are coming from either the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, or the United States. The United States being ahead by far. And so you're seeing those attacks making it very difficult to have that diplomatic conversation, because you're saying, hey, I've got Russian actors that are taking on me, and you're giving them safe harbor. They're like, we don't see any of that. Where's it from? And you point to an IP range that's in like Indiana. And, so you have a challenge there in making the case, but you still have to kind of be more transparent about the work we're doing to clean up our own house and to work on that infrastructure with companies that really are good at this. And so that we can get that kind of conversation going. I think that's going to be more of the explainer for our international partners, as opposed to saying, you have a problem in your country. We can actually say, hey, as a result of some infrastructure that exists within our dotted lines, this is how we're addressing it. These are tools we're bringing to bear. This is the legal framework we're using. Are you seeing the same thing? Because a lot of this is going on in the same country. It's popular, number one, the US in the US, but in the UK, it's the UK as well, because it's where people start to ferret out bad actors. So that's part of what we have to do, is kind of be better at being explainers of how we're mitigating some of these risks and going after some of this infrastructure here with locked arms with the private sector. And until we get better at that cadence, we have a challenge in bringing in some of our broader international partners.
I mean, you mentioned UK a couple of times there. And for me, that's a segue into also, do Five Eyes have some role here? What about Australia, New Zealand, Canada?
Absolutely. Well, and there is something to say about the fact that the Five Eyes as a whole has worked on tool development and being able to look for nation state adversaries to where they might be the ones that are catching it more. So it's one of those things where they know that if you have an IP range from China, you're not going to let that get at your critical infrastructure. You're going to start working against it. So I would imagine in areas of the world where they don't have as sophisticated defenses, they're probably from all over the place. And so it's a bit of a balance.
Yeah. And Catherine, whether you want to answer this or one of the others, but what are potential unforeseen, I mean, if they're unforeseen consequences, we can't foresee them, but I mean, what are the unintended consequences of this sort of moving from the status quo and moving into a more aggressive posture here? I mean, from an industry point of view, do you see particular challenges or concerns there?
If the question is, what are sort of the challenges I see, if we go to a cyber offense and we've got lots of really cool crackerjacks out there in the cyber Wild West, whoa, it's going to be a mess. I mean, as it is right now, and I think some of the people who mentioned earlier, Cyber Command, the deconfliction of activities going on. I mean, back in the old days, the Corsairs, I understand that's the politically correct phrase to use, on their ships would have I'm a Corsair flag. And so, if you were a bad guy, you'd run, or if you thought you were going to come after you, you'd run. And if you were not involved, you still like, not my problem, bye, So how does one deconflict the Corsair kind of behavior in this cyber offense, particularly for someone who has some global perspective of sort of what the normal traffic flows that goes into and that goes out are? A deconfliction is absolutely critical. And to the point earlier, deconfliction takes time. State, local, federal, international, industry, government, no mechanism in place. And yet I think that would be not only useful, but almost critical to true effectiveness. So that's the first one that sort of comes up. And I think on some level, that's enough. Otherwise, we're in friendly fire situation.
Hey, I got to tell one funny story. So, because this letters of marque thing is driving me crazy. And I know we're about to get to it, but I just say, when I was a junior officer, I was on a prize crew of a drug, we took over a small boat that had a lot of drugs on it. And 4 of us were put on board, 3 enlisted guys and me, to take the boat into a U.S. naval base. And as we're heading in, they're like, "What's a prize crew, sir?" And I said, "Well, what it was." And they said, and I explained to them what splitting the money and everything. And they said, "Well, we're going to be rich." I said, "Explain to me how we're going to sell 1,000 pounds of cocaine pulling into a Navy ship." So I think our last real prize crew is 1942. The last time we paid it off was about 1880. I mean, prize crews are a legacy. and letters of marque or legacy. I worry a lot. I agree with everything Catherine said. I'm going to add in what was implied in the truth, which is loss of escalation management. And this thing can escalate on you rapidly. If you have a company out there who is paid for their success, they will continue to press in and press harder till they achieve success and knock an adversary offline. And in doing so, may knock the critical infrastructure of an adversary offline. And then you get escalation management back at you. And so I'm very worried about, I hate this legislation. That doesn't mean I'm opposed to it because everything else is failing. I kind of like to talk about the letter of marque legislation so I can then go, well, if you don't like that, sir, let me show you some National Guard improvements we can do and try to get them back on the right long-term answer. But the problem is the answers that are being provided other than letter of marque are 3 and 4 year long processes of building systems and doing things right. And the problem is expediency kicks the shit out of doing things right a lot of the time. But you got to be careful of that expediency because you'll get this law of unintended consequences. And you'll end up with, I think, to me, the biggest one's escalation management. I mean, that's why apparently we don't respond often. And, and if we leave this to someone where the return on response is, that you get paid, I think there's going to be vice. You end up in a war. I'm a little concerned about escalation management.
Yeah, I mean, chipping in a personal comment here, and I think I was talking with Chris about this a bit earlier in the day. The sort of model of the letters of marque and the role the court says or whatever was probably fit for purpose in the era of supreme sovereigns who could grant any immunity they wanted and take whatever cut they wanted.
And no lawyers.
And no lawyers, exactly. Plausible deniability all the way. And I'm really not convinced that, well, I'm trying to be a diplomat because that was my job for a number of years. Doesn't sound like this is really fit for purpose in terms of what problem we're trying to solve. But my question is, I mean, is everyone familiar with this letters of marque idea? I think so, yeah. So if this is the only game in town and the only piece of legislation which is close to what we're doing, is this itself a problem? And if it's not that piece of legislation, if it's just a stupid idea or a distraction, what else have we got that we should be looking to Congress to lead on?
I'll step until you hear a click. So the real need here is for there be a balanced approach that is a response with all the levers of government in tow. So the correct answer is yes, we should have offensive capability that scales to the need. But at the same time, we should have a series of levers across government that include sanctions and include trade policies and include every element at our disposal when there is a cyber let's just call it engagement at this point, because it's a domain in which people are flexing to have supremacy over the information domain in which we are practicing commerce. I mean, the challenge is we need to be able to say our critical infrastructure shall not be held at bay by people that have the US's intent negative. Like that's the policy side we need to have, and then work reverse to that and say what will affect that, and that could be trade policy. It could be anything that you can think that the federal government or state government have at their disposal. But at the same time, there needs to be a way that for Cyber Command to do their thing, CNMF to do their thing, for international partnerships to work. There's also the proactive defense layer to tee that up. What we're really getting at from the letters of marque perspective is just enough isn't being done. Private sector cannot say when they look themselves in the mirror and talk to their risk executives that the US government is doing something, and I mean anything, that they can point to publicly that deters cyber actors from taking them on personal. And that is why people are looking for anything to grab onto. And so they're looking for liability protection to act as if they were the government. That's really what the Letters of Marque Act is. And so when you start to take that on and say, okay, where can the government be vocal? Where can the government be loud to kind of push back against this transparency issue?
Yeah. Catherine?
If we could, and we've had this discussion about global norms for a long time. And I grant you that Japan is right off the blocks. The point is that if Japan is talking about no take backs, whatever, that's a shift in global norms. What I'm really looking for is not so much the offensive thing, but I am looking for a faster collective defense so that it ends up being a real pain in the neck for bad guys to try to do it. If I know that Lumen's going to do something because they seem to be coming after me, and I can get the entire comm sector to do the same thing. If I can then extend that to other sectors, if I can extend that to the British telecoms and the NTTs in Japan, so that we're sort of like, no, this is sort of I think the phrase the government likes to use is known bad. That there's just so little that's kind of really good about it. So it says that we are all individually, collectively taking defensive action, which is our right.
So more musketeer than
Yes.
corsair.
Now,
then.
would it be helpful if we had this, National Guard force who could, in essence, amplify the research, the backwards engineering, so that it doesn't take 12 months to get to attribution and takedown, which and zero complaints. Our government partners in these things have been extraordinary. But if we could get that from tip and cue to now, this is really known bad, and we're going to talk to the Netherlands about, no, you're going to go in and you're going to dismantle it in 3 months. That's a more obvious sort of cause, effect, consequence.
I answered this in question 1 and 2, I think. I think we absolutely positive. The reason this letter of marque has any staying power right now is that everything else is failing. All the other legislation, we're not getting it done. What we need to do is dig down, do the long-term thing to fix our force generation, our cyber force, to fix the National Guard, to get a reserves that people can move back and forth in between, all those kind of things. Another simple one, somehow we've moronically canceled CPAC 4 months ago and got in there, in addition to screwing up DHS's authorities, which DHS is apparently allowed to do, they accidentally knocked off one of NSA's authorities for the enduring framework. You would be surprised. I have a piece of legislation. I was briefing it today on the Hill for a floor amendment. Guys like, I'm not sure we need to do that. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. You want to entertain? This is the same people entertaining letter of marque. And they're like, well, this thing where we'd share, bi-directional information sharing, that seems dangerous. I'm like, it's not dangerous. This is actually what we need to do. But to me, there are a lot of simple legislative processes that we can get done to get ourselves in. But it's going to take us 3 to 4 years. When you dig a hole for 25 years, you're not going to fill it in 3 months or 2 months. And this is like I said, the only reason I like this bill is it gives you an introduction to talk about other pieces of legislation that more reasonably attack the problem. Again, I can't, no one's saying right now, our Navy's short like 100 ships. Think we can, give a private sector company a call, see if they want to contribute some naval forces to the next fight. I mean, in no other warfare area are we legitimately, out there trying to outsource this warfighting capability in a way. And when we've done it, and I can think of a few cases we did it 20 years ago, I think we came to regret it. We need to be responsible. We don't need, Prigozhin, and a Wagner group running around, right? We are the United States of America. And as much as I can hate lawyers, we actually get this done right because we actually have a transparent, rules-based system that does this properly. So from my point of view, this is not the way to go. It's going to get us in trouble. Giving someone blanket liability protection. I know it's not blanket, but giving them liability protection will eventually, they will stress that liability protection till it should not legitimately apply. And I think that's a mistake.
And on that point, I mean, what is the risk, particularly to your point, that this is the least, not the least bad thing that's going around. It's the only thing that's going around given everything else. What is the risk that other countries are going to follow and say, hey, this is a really good idea and we're going to start it as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Israelis are like, hey, you're like sanctioning some of our companies that are thinking about doing this. So that's the other thing. I mean, this is slightly different than what is happening in Israel, but it is not completely unrelated. I'm not sure, do I think Europe and Asia are less administratively controlled than the United States? No, I think that, I think these things will go slow there. Do I think China and Russia are already doing it? Yes. Iran? Yes. I mean, I think the battlefield's the way it is. That the issue is we're a country of laws. We're a country that does things deliberately and appropriate. I say this right now, it's hard to eat, but we do things by, properly. We have separation of powers. That this is a mistake for Congress to to approve this. This legislation, and I'd say one other thing, this legislation never get approved in a million years because the jurisdictional challenges in getting this law passed. I mean, you can't get good laws passed because of jurisdictional differences. So I would hope bad laws are even harder to pass. So I'm not holding my breath on this law getting passed. You know, I sleep well thinking this law is not going to pass, but it brings up the bigger issue of how do you fix this problem?
Yeah.
And you fix this problem by knuckling down and building up a good capability using the forces that we're allowed to use, which I think are, as I said, predominantly National Guard, working with state authorities and with DHS authorities to do this. And it's just going to take time.
Yep.
And when you screw up for as long as we did, it takes longer than it should.
Catherine?
Well, this goes without saying, CISA 25 really should be renewed. Sorry, 2015. It needs to be renewed. Yeah, okay. I will comment that.
And change the name to it, please, because we
Yes,
can't go
because we
through
get
this
rid of
with Rand
the-
Paul anymore.
Yeah.
No, I recognize that the bad guys don't care whether or not you're allowed to information share, but, we are a nation of laws and, as a nation, we've spent a lot of time sort of doing this. But having that as a foundation is really important. It is disturbing that, there has been in essence the recession of sort of the advisory committee activity. And we understand it will come back, but what it comes back at and how it's rebranded and when, I don't know. So in the meantime, I don't want people to think that people aren't working. Industry is taking the lead. So I've had more discussions certainly within our sector, with other sectors, with other entities about, okay, to Mark's sort of bad nightmare, all the power systems down, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I think that allowance to sort of like accelerate the collaboration in response to potential bad things is good, that we're doing it and not waiting if it were for government, because we've been working on the National Cyber Incident Response Plan since the last time it was done 10 years ago, and it's still in sort of draft comment stage. So in the absence of that, what would we do tomorrow is the question that we're sort of facing. Do we have all the answers? No. The fact that we're having the conversation and we're trying to make progress on it, I think that is key. And to have CPAC, we'd be able to then call, by the way, we came up with this great plan, and in case stuff happens tomorrow, this is where you can meet us. Call us here and engage that way. I think that's the approach we're taking right now. We're continuing to move forward.
And the only thing I would add is that when looking at this challenge right now, it's very difficult to think 6 months, a year from now, we have any different solutions than we're talking right now. But when we think at the 5-year horizon mark, we are looking at wire speed communication where we're talking shared, automated, indicator to indicator, defense to defense, active defenses that are going to make it more expensive and harder to get into that Fortune 500 world. The critical infrastructure of SLTT is still always going to be a focus. The have-nots are always going to be a focus. Health is still going to be a challenging sector, but we're going to get a little bit of a buffer from some of those that have the wallet to throw at this giant fireball of death cyber problem. The also benefit is with that, we'll start to get faster attribution. We'll start to get faster state of play from a global perspective of these are the bad actors, this is what they're doing. And because they just rarely stay to a particular sector. They just take the opportunity as it's available. So if there's a vulnerability on a particular router, they're looking at all those routers to see which one's the most valuable to poach. They're not saying, oh, that's a health sector router, I'm going to go after that. So you have an opportunity into the future in which we will have a much faster and more transparent view of these adversarial actions, both criminal and nation state alike, which will allow us a little more cannon fire, to stay on the metaphor there, to use in the public domain to try and align a lot of voices in the same direction, both domestically and internationally. But until we get to that spot, we do have a challenge in which at least something of a deterrent has to come forward, or we're just going to have a challenge where there's just not enough back and forth to deter anyone from making that decision to take a shot at critical infrastructure here in the United States.
I mean, we have a few more minutes before the end of this session. I don't know, would you be up for seeing if there's any questions from the audience? See if we can keep this.
As
Are
long
there
as they're
any questions
nice.
from the audience? Everyone wants to get to drinks.
If not, can I say one last thing? Because I've been really disciplined about not bringing up Cyberforce. And that ends now. Listen, it is this whole idea of having offensive cyber capability. So the number we agreed to, a bunch of us, 2 or 3 of us in a room, like in 2011, agreed to a number, each representing me and Nakasone and a guy named Breedlove, representing services, agreed to a number like, I want to say like 6,400. There's some Marines in there that I can't remember the number. It was around 6,400. So today, the numbers, that's how many offensive cyber on-net operators we agreed to provide. That included some intel in there and some other things. The number now is 6,700 13 years later. Who believes that the threat has changed 3% over 13 years? No one. The Chinese don't. The Chinese number differential is 1,000% over that same time frame. I'm not saying 1,000% right. I am saying 3% is really freaking wrong, right? And why is this? It's because we're leaving this with military services who have to decide, do I grow the cyber force or do I man my ship, my aircraft squadrons, and my battalions? And they always vote for the latter. If I go to Randy George, the head of the Army right now, he'll say, Mark, stop saying I don't prioritize cyber. It's a priority. And I'm like, okay, and your top 17 priorities you list, which one is it? 13. All right. And the Navy, it's 12 of 14. That was the last CNO said that when put on the mark. The problem with that, of course, is only the first 5 get fed. The next 5 stay neutral, and the last 5 or 6 are bill payers. So cyber's been a bill payer. It's never going to grow as long as it's left to the services. And I'm not blaming the services. They're protecting their own. When they're called on, nobody says to the Navy, where the hell are your Navy on-net operators? They say, where the hell are your Navy submarines, aircraft carriers, destroyers? Fill it in for the Air Force and the Army and the Marine Corps. So you're never going to win. You're never going to succeed as long as you leave the shit with the services. So if you want to be good at offensive operations, if you want to have a reserve, because reserves come from active duty, the Guard come from active duty. The vast majority of these on-net operators they don't become on-net operators purely through the Guard most of the time. They come through these. So if you're going to have this system that works, that protects your defensive critical infrastructures, that makes sure you're doing this shit to the enemy, which is the number one way to deter, you're going to have to start having a force that grows from 6,400 or 6,700 on-net operators to 16,000 or 20,000 over the next 5 to 7 years. The only way you can recruit, train, maintain, and retain that kind of force is if you have a dedicated cyber service. And we got to stop arguing about this and go do it, and then we'll get the Guard and the reserves to support. Lack of discipline noted.
Interesting call to arms. Yeah. So, Matt, any other?
I think every
final
time we
comments?
have these conversations, it really illuminates that while we are getting very astute at smart defenses, integrated defenses, collective defenses, and proactive defenses, there are still a gap when it comes to deterrent effects for deciding to attack U.S. critical infrastructure or global critical infrastructure. And so until we have something that makes any bad actor second guess their activities, we have a gap that needs to be addressed.
Right. Any last comments, Karen?
I agree. I think we are doing better in the whole cyber collective defense. But if I had to say on a scale of 1 to 10 where we are in terms of progress, I think we're really, really proud of hitting a 4. And I think that we should be really, really proud of being an 8. If we were an 8, it would be more obvious for purpose of discussion and legislation with when does a mark or something like that come into play. If industry collectively with government and governments was better about the collaboration on fast defense, I think it would be more obvious where maybe offense comes into play. And that can be done today. And I don't need a lot of legislation for it today. I just need sort of the will to do it and to and some supporting actions in terms of CISA 2015 and maybe an ability to advise government that we're doing that.
Okay, thank you. So Catherine, Matt, Mark, thanks so much for this session. Join me in thanking the 3 of the panelists for this very lively session.
Thank you so much, Peter and panelists, for that. And thank you to all of our keynote speakers and moderators and panelists, and also to Bree and the rest of our analysts and our marketing team, for all of you in the audience for joining us today. I think we covered a tremendous amount of ground, and just looking at some of the themes, you know, I'm going to highlight a couple here. You know, we need to move beyond, and I'm not endorsing all of this, they're just observations we've collected through the day. But thematically, moving beyond information sharing and really focusing on operational collaboration, looking at metrics. How do we measure our success here? How do we develop more market incentives? How do we start joining objectives to tools to outcomes? How do we combine multiple cyber tools and capabilities, as well as combining multiple tactics, including outside of cyberspace, perhaps, to shut down and deter our adversaries around the world? We need to think more critically about imposing timely and meaningful consequences. We've heard multiple times today that we are living in the past. This time machine that we've been talking about, our current methods are not working. We need to make it more expensive for threat actors to attack us. This is a new term for me. We are in a paradigm lock in cyber deterrence. No one is really deterred. And then also, finally, we're really not doing anything at scale. That sounds very bleak, but I actually am encouraged by this conversation, and especially by the amount of, fear of bringing up an overly used term, public-private sector collaboration and coordination. It is very real, and that's what all of you are doing here today. And so whatever you want to call it, I very much appreciate your attendance. The debates around hacking back, active defense, and international norms, they're not easy, but they're absolutely essential. Moving forward is going to require that collaboration between all of us to ensure that these strategies not only keep pace with our adversaries, but also reflect our values and commitments to stability and the rule of law. Really hope that these conversations leave you today with hope, and that you look forward to continuing those conversations. Certainly, please do so outside. We have a reception for the next couple of hours. And thank you again, truly, for being here and spending the entire day. I am thrilled at how packed this room still is. And thank you to everyone joining us virtually. Have a great week. Thank you.